Tell us, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to each of the witnesses for being here. I think this is an issue that impacts a great many families. Whether you go to sporting games, I go to a lot of sporting activities, or whether you go to concerts, or whether you go to plays, families enjoy going out. They enjoy entertainment. And going through the process of getting a ticket can sometimes be gratifying and a lot of times really frustrating. I start from the principle that free markets are good, that if you want to have goods and services delivered to consumers, that free and competitive markets are the most effective way to do so at the most price competitive levels. I also start from a principle that monopolies are bad, that monopolies historically have hurt consumers, driven up costs, reduced options, and made the consumer experience markedly worse. I also would make an observation that in the big tech sphere in particular, we've seen monopolies being willing to be particularly abusive. I want to start with a question for the witnesses, and Mr. Gretzinger, I'm going to start with you and just ask, in your judgment, is Ticketmaster a monopoly?
Unequivocally.
Mr. Mickelson?
Yes, sir, without a doubt.
Mr. Nuzzo?
Yes, absolutely.
Ms. Bradish?
It's certainly acting like a monopoly.
Mr. Lawrence?
I'm not sure.
Okay. So, Mr. Berchtold, do you agree with the other witnesses on this panel?
We absolutely believe the ticketing business has never been more competitive. We believe that fact is demonstrated by every venue renewal that has multiple credible offers in a bidding process.
So are they just making it up? Why does everyone else perceive you as a monopoly? Where's that coming from?
I can't speak to all of their motivations on their points of view, but I think that if you simply look at what is the market power exercised by venues, which is perhaps not fully understood in our business.
How about on the ticketing side? What percent of the market do y'all have?
I would estimate, depending on how you want to count what's in the market, between 50 and 60%. 50
and 60, and depending on how you count it, does anyone have a markedly different measure of that?
Yes, sir, Senator. They have 87% of the ticketing contracts at the NBA and the NHL arenas. They have 93% of the ticketing contracts at the NFL stadiums. Those are the most important venues. You cannot include, if he's including, it's, yes, I'll stop there.
And can I fairly blame Mr. Berchtold for the Texans having such a lousy season and the Rockets having such a lousy seasons and the Cowboys just losing? I mean, but the Astros did win the World Series, so I have something to cheer about. But I guess I can't blame you for that, but I recognize the frustration. Let me ask you, Ticketmaster's dominant position in the marketplace, how does it hurt consumers? Mr. Gretzinger?
Most fundamentally by eliminating competition. There's not a vibrant group of dozens of companies out there competing to build the best consumer experience.
And what does that mean if you want to go see a game? What does that mean for a consumer? How is life worse because there's not a more effective competition in the marketplace?
It means you're beholden to whatever Ticketmaster Live Nation gives you, and they have an incentive to not innovate and to maintain the status quo because the status quo benefits them versus having a vibrant group of competition that's working to do what's best for consumers, artists, venues, all of the stakeholders in this industry.
Mr. Mickelson?
It's a bigger question than just Ticketmaster, because when you combine Live Nation with Ticketmaster, it's the different question.
All right, well, answer it that way then, the two together.
Yes. Look, the combination of the two provides them with a different business model than the rest of us independent promoters. We have to make money at putting on concerts. They don't, because they make more money from ticketing and from sponsorship than they do from concerts. And concerts is basically a lost leader for them to bring more talent and bring more content to the arenas that they're servicing to get the ticketing contracts.
So your testimony is they're essentially undercutting the competition in the live performance market and subsidizing it using the ticket revenue. Is that, am
Ticket
I-
revenue and sponsorship revenue, yes.
okay. Mr. Nuzza?
And here's how it looks to the consumer. A friend of mine sent me a screenshot of a ticket purchase she made for, I believe it was a Shania Twain concert in Orlando, and the tickets were $227 each, but when she got to the final screen where she had to actually hit the button to make the order, they turned into $291 a piece. That works out to a 30% bump on the very last screen of the transaction. She had no choice at that point but to accept that bump in price. That's how it looks to a consumer.
Ms. Bradish?
Well, I think Sal brings up a great point with choice. It reduces the choice, not just of consumers who have to pay higher ticket fees, but also of artists like Mr. Lawrence. They don't have a choice of what venues to go to, what ticketing businesses that they will be dealing with. And for others all up and down the supply chain and live entertainment, these kind of behaviors reduce choice.
And Mr. Lawrence, finally for artists, what's the impact?
The impact is that we have very little say or transparency or choice in a lot of aspects of how the financials of our deals are put together, and no say or choice or visibility in what our fans experience when buying our tickets.
And if the chair will give me the indulgence of one very quick final question.
Sure.
Which is one of the things that's come up has been all-in ticketing, both for consumers and/or transparency for artists. Do any of the witnesses disagree with the proposition that that would be a good idea and a material improvement from where we are today?
No disagreement from JAM as an independent promoter, none.
Okay, well, some area of agreement, that's always a good thing.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to each of the witnesses. Ms. Newland, as you know, in January of last year, the Senate voted on my legislation to impose sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and it did so before Russia had invaded Ukraine. When the Senate voted on those sanctions, President Zelensky publicly urged, even begged, the United States Senate to pass those sanctions. And President Zelensky said, passing those sanctions then were the last chance to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, the last chance to prevent Russian tanks rolling into Ukraine. Was President Zelensky wrong?
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. I personally, having been involved, along with my boss, Secretary Blinken, in all of those negotiations with Russia to try to prevent this war in December, do not believe that had that Nord Stream 2 been cut off in January, that would have been decisive for Putin. It was important that the day the war began, the Germans cut the pipeline, as did the rest of the Europeans, but he was bound and determined to go into Ukraine, as you know.
So you believe Zelensky was wrong when he said stopping Nord Stream 2 was the last and best way to stop this war?
I don't think it would have stopped Putin, and, you know,
when the government of Poland similarly said, begged the United States Senate to pass those sanctions and said this is the last and best opportunity to stop Russia from invading Ukraine, you believe Poland was wrong too?
I do not believe we would have prevented this war had the Europeans acted faster on Nord Stream 2. I wish it were the case, but I don't think it would have stopped.
Okay, well, let's talk about how the war is going. And I know that you and I both agree that it is important for Russia to suffer a crushing defeat. Putin is a KGB thug, and he's committed to undermining our interests, and our enemies across the globe, including in particular China, are watching carefully what happens in Ukraine. The Iranian regime is watching as well, and Iran is committed to doing everything they can to ensure Putin's victory. They're supplying Putin with resources, especially drones, which are devastating Ukrainian civilians and military assets. Meanwhile, the Biden administration, which waived the sanctions on Nord Stream 2 the last and best hope of preventing the war, right now today continues to be obsessed with a new nuclear deal with Iran. Iranian officials say talks remain ongoing, while administration officials say they remain committed to diplomacy, but not right now. I'm deeply concerned that this administration, even in the middle of a war, is subordinating the need to counter the Russian-Iranian alliance to its own partisan political preferences. For example, this administration has dropped the general UN arms embargo against Iran. This administration has made Russia our intermediary in nuclear talks with Iran. This administration has issued sanctions waivers, allowing the Ayatollah to become Putin's nuclear client. This administration has withheld weapons for Ukraine to target Iranian operatives in Crimea, helping Russia launch drones. And this administration has avoided using relevant sanctions authority against Iranian banks, facilitating the transfer of drones to Iran. As a result, Iran has been able to dramatically boost Putin's war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, America and the American taxpayer are shouldering the burden of assisting Ukraine, while the Biden administration is greasing both sides of this war. Let's talk about Iran's supply of drones to Russia. The Biden administration made an immediate decision to go to the United Nations and drop the general UN arms embargo on Iran because they say it was required by the original JCPOA nuclear deal. Biden officials say part of the embargo dealing with drones is still in place, but even that measure will expire this fall pursuant to the JCPPA. I believe the Biden administration should immediately go to the UN, invoke our snapback authority, and keep the embargo in place. Do you agree? Or do you believe we should allow the UN arms embargo on Iran to expire and allow Iranian drones to continue to go to Russia and be used against the people of Ukraine?
Time of the senator has expired, but please answer his question.
Thank you. Senator Cruz, you are absolutely right that Iranian drones are fueling this war, and that is why we have taken many increased sanctions measures against Iran over the last couple of months, including against the IRGC Guard Corps Aerospace Force, the Quds Force Aviation Industry, the Shahed Aviation Industry, Russian Aerospace Forces.
Have you stopped the drones?
We have not stopped the drones, and this is part of the problem. But we know what Iran looks like, and we also know who Russia's friends are: Iran, North Korea, and Hamas. As you know, we are not currently in active discussions with Iran. It is not prepared to take these negotiations seriously right now, and we have many of the same concerns that you have, but I look forward to speaking with you in a separate setting about our larger strategy vis-a-vis Iran. I think this is probably not the appropriate setting for that.
Thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Menendez, and thank you, all three of you, for your service and for your work to continue to help lead the efforts of our administration in combating
technology in the point-to-point system. But anyway, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to each of the witnesses, and thank you also. There are many pilots and individuals who are here for this hearing, and I know many of you are Texans, and so welcome to Washington. We're glad to have you here. Captain Murray, let me return to what you and Chair Cantwell were just discussing. In the view of the Southwest pilots, what caused 16,000 flights to be canceled, and what needs to be done to prevent that from happening again?
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Cruz. Again, it was a cascade of events that ultimately caused, the failure in IT, the failure in its ability to keep up, the loss of where pilots, where airplanes, and where crews were, a failure of infrastructure. Our operations agents who have a front row to our customers and board our airplanes weren't sure what was going on, nor could get answers. So it was a failure epically from top to bottom. We had crews that were on the phone. We have screenshots, 17 hours on the phone trying to get a hold of someone. Many of our frontline employees went above and beyond and were able to cobble together a crew, cobble together an airplane, get passengers, and they did that on their own. And so when I said in my oral testimony that, you know, they rely, and they've continued to rely more and more on being supported by their employees, the employees are the ones that did the Herculean task of kind of trying to recover.
So in your testimony, you expressed frustration that in your view, management was not listening to the concerns of the pilots. Could you elaborate on that frustration, and do you feel that the changes that are needed are being implemented now?
Well, the pilots have been sounding the alarm bells for over a decade. We've been the whistleblowers on this. We've watched this progress and seen these meltdowns occur. I've laid it out in my written testimony for you. We've seen these meltdowns occur with more frequency and more severity. We have tried to get them. We love our airline, and they have to be better. And we are trying to partner with them, and I think that's key. The frontline operators, whether it's a baggage cart, whether it's a fueling truck, whether it's a pilot, whether it's flight attendant, whether it's customer service agent, all have frontline experience in seeing what goes on. And there has to be a partnering. We are a very data-driven organization at SWAPA. We have provided them point-to-point solutions for their point-to-point network. So I think there has to be, this isn't an IT fix. This isn't a plug and play. Again, it's got to be holistic, and it's got to be addressed, and it can be addressed tomorrow in a process.
And to clarify, your criticism is not with the point-to-point model. Southwest is unusual. Most other airlines have a hub-and-spoke model, whereas Southwest has a point-to-point model. And some members of this committee have raised concerns with the point-to-point model. I will say, as a customer, I actually find it very convenient, and there's a reason I'm on a Southwest flight just about every week of the year, but your concern is not with the point-to-point model, is that
Absolutely
correct?
not. I do believe that if you look at Southwest Airlines' history in comparison to the rest of the industry, since our existence, we have made money every year except during 2020. The rest of the airlines have not. And I believe that is the magic of our point-to-point system. I think our customers love it. I believe it gives us a competitive edge. More importantly, during downtimes, it provides some flexibility and some agility to take advantage of times. Herb Kelleher has a famous quote that we've predicted 12 out of the last 5 recessions. And it was our point-to-point network that provided for that.
Dr. Winston, some of the proposals that have been discussed by Democrats on this committee, and indeed by President Biden in the State of the Union address, involve the government regulating things like pricing, things like fees that customers are paying, regulating things unrelated to safety. And let me be clear, I think it is an integral responsibility of the government, the FAA, to focus on safety and ensure safety for the flying public. And I can understand the appeal of saying to people, you don't want to pay this fee or that fee. I could understand the appeal of saying that every airline must have only first-class seats and a free foot massage with every flight, and that would make flying quite comfortable, but it would also predictably drive up the cost of air travel and price many Americans out of the market of being able to travel for work or leisure. So, Dr. Winston, what would the effect be of the regulations being discussed for the flying public, and would consumers be better off or worse off with the federal government regulating pricing and fees and other aspects of airline travel unrelated to safety?
Thank you. So I think the important thing here, we need to be specific, and we want to work with the counterfactual. So we don't, it's a little hard to understand if we go very general saying a regulation. I want to know, what regulation are we talking about? And then we just spin through, okay, what is going to be the full effect of that regulation? So I'll mention one. You know, suppose we say that all checked luggage is free. You know, we have to allow people to be able to check luggage and not charge them. And, you know, on the face of it, that sounds a good thing. People want to check their luggage. They don't want to pay extra fees, but then spin through what's going to happen. Well, airlines are going to incur costs from that. This is all airlines, not just Southwest. And this is a competitive industry. And they can't incur these costs. They have to pass them on, and they will with higher fares. And we can continue to do this exercise with pretty much anything that I've heard thus far recommended. Now, people complain about transparency. That's a different issue. I mean, certainly airlines, and I don't really know why companies do this, can say, look, here's the price, and quote, does not include in bold letters extras. Put an asterisk and say, here are the extras. So people know they have to pay for baggage, and so on and so forth. So, that's in general what we can expect to see, and we can plug in specific policies. Am I allowed to say something else?
Well, if it's really very short, because we're over this time and we need to get to various members.
Okay, very short. All airlines run point to point. The only flights that are not point to point are those that crash. Southwest really does not run that different a network than other airlines.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Acting Administrator Nolan, the FAA has been charged with modernizing NOTAM for 10 years. Why has it taken 10 years, and why isn't it done yet?
Well, thank you, Senator Cruz, for the question. We have been on a journey of modernization, starting back in 2009 as we began the scoping, and we brought on, in 2013, we brought on the federal NOTAM system. So that process, and we've had enhancement along the way. We are about 4 years, the substantive part of that modernization.
Okay, let me ask again, why has it taken 10 years, and why is it still not done?
That it does take a while. This is the system, the complexity of our NAS. The NOTAMs is just one of thousands of systems that comprise how we oversee the NAS, how we communicate, how we give NOTAMs. This is something
I heard you right, your current plan is not to have it modernized until fiscal year 2025, so 2 to 3 years from now. What's to prevent another ground stop in the 2 to 3 years between now and then?
Thank you. When I say we're moving to 2025, the work is ongoing. We do have 80% of the users onto the federal NOTAM system. We have added redundancies to ensure that
But the 80% of users, if I understand you correct, that didn't stop a ground stop of everybody. Is that correct?
It did. When we did a ground stop, that was a ground stop for all departing traffic on the morning.
Okay, so the 80% didn't help. It's not like it was only a 20% ground stop. Everyone shut down the first time since 9/11. Let me ask you, I agree very, very strongly with the questions that Chairwoman Cantwell raised about redundancy. And do the fixes that you've proposed remove the risk of a similar single point of failure for knocking the NOTAM system offline?
We believe the fixes that we have in place today will prevent a recurrence of the event that we saw on January 11th.
Mr. Nolan, you're not answering the question. Will the fixes remove the risk of a similar single point of failure from knocking the system out? Is there redundancy being built into it, or can a single screw-up ground air traffic nationwide?
We have, when we think about the age of our system and the age of the systems we do have redundancy there. Could I sit here today and tell you there will never be another issue on the NOTAM system? No, sir, I cannot. What I can say is that we are making every effort to modernize and look at our procedures. In fact, part of this investigation has us working with MITRE and other entities to look at across the totality of our systems, how they interrelate, what is the level of redundancy, and is there any additional thing that we need to do? And certainly we'll have more as that investigation ensues.
Well, I think you're going to see, as you have seen, bipartisan interest in assisting the FAA in ensuring redundancy so that we don't see air traffic grounded again. And in focusing more broadly, I hope, on modernization of air traffic control. I want to shift to the near crashes we've had, and understandably, I'm particularly focused on what happened in Austin. 2 weeks ago, there was a near collision on the runway at Austin Bergstrom Airport. A Southwest flight was taking off from that runway. A FedEx plane was preparing to land, they came incredibly close to crashing. Millions of Texans fly every year. I have flown on Southwest flights out of Austin literally hundreds, if not thousands of times. I actually have a video that was created that is a reproduction of what happened. It's a recreation, but it's based on the flight data. So if we could play that video, and I'd like to get your reaction to it.
Roger, route to 737. Roger. Southwest 00, confirm on the roll. Rolling now. Southwest aboard. FedEx is on the go. Southwest 708, Roger, keep turning right when able. Negative. Climb maintain 3000, maybe you can turn left heading 080. Wind turn to 0803000, FedEx 1432 Heavy.
So I know the incident is under investigation.
It's 1432 Heavy, Roger, sir.
But if you were sitting on that Southwest flight and you knew how close you came to having a plane land on top of you, killing every person on that plane, you would understandably be horrified. It is only through, as I understand it, the heroism of the pilots being alert and seeing what was happening that that tragedy was averted. And yet, my question is, how can this happen? How did air traffic control direct one plane onto the runway to take off and another plane to land and have them both within 100 feet of each other? And what can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Well, thank you, Senator Cruz, for the question. Certainly, we are letting the investigation play itself out. Having been an airline captain, having been a pilot for more than 42 years, and an accident investigator, we'll go where the facts take us. What is not represented on the video there, it appears to, I clear below in 22 days, what we'd say in pilot jargon, but actually the tower visibility was 0, it was a low visibility day. It is not what we would expect to have happen. But when we think about the controls, how we train both our controllers and our pilots, the system works as it's designed to avert what you say could have been a horrific outcome. The pilots saw, the FedEx pilots saw.
Let me just underscore the urgency of preventing that sort of incident from happening again.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Milgram, would you agree that the vast majority of the heroin, the methamphetamine, and fentanyl we see in American communities comes from Mexico?
Senator, I would say that the vast majority of fentanyl and meth is coming from the two cartels, Jalisco and Sinaloa, from Mexico. They also transport heroin and cocaine in, but I would not say the vast majority of heroin and cocaine. Okay. I would say the vast majority of fentanyl and meth.
Would you also agree that the brave men and women working along the southern border and at our ports of entry, our Border Patrol and CBP officers, serve a critical role in interdicting drugs before they hit our streets?
Senator, as I say often, the way at DEA, we are the only single mission federal law enforcement agency committed to narcotics and to stopping the global supply chain. We play offense, and so we're tracking these cartels worldwide and across our
So is that a yes? We've got limited time.
DHS's responsibility is to maintain the southern border and the ports of entry. Our investigations do tell us that the vast majority of fentanyl is coming in the ports of entry, 2 particularly in California and 2 in Arizona.
So is that a yes, that you would agree that CBP officers, both on the southern border and the ports of entry, play a critical role in interdicting drugs?
Yes, Senator. I believe it's a DHS responsibility, and it's a critical one.
So if we decided to cut the number of Border Patrol agents dramatically, let's say in half, would you agree that would hurt our efforts to stop illegal drugs?
Senator, I would defer some of this to the Department of Homeland Security and Secretary Mayorkas.
You're not willing to answer that question?
But here's what I would say about this. We believe that DHS plays vital defense.
Okay, those are talking points. Would cutting the number of CBP agents in half hurt our ability to stop drugs? Yes or no?
Senator, I believe it would.
Okay. That's effectively what's happened under the Biden administration. Because right now today, more than half of the CBP agents are engaged in housekeeping and chauffeurs and babysitting of the 5.5 million illegal aliens who have crossed the border. They're not on the border. They're not at the ports of entry. They are instead processing the highest rate of illegal immigration in history. Now, Democrat members of Congress have the remarkable claim that the open borders under Joe Biden has no impact on the record fentanyl and drugs that are flooding across our borders. Between October 2021 and September 2022, one CBP source estimated there were 364,000 gotaways, people that ran away at the southern border. Another Border Patrol officials put the number of gotaways at 1.2 million. Gotaways can vary from terrorists on the terror watch list. In fiscal year 2022, 98 people on the terror watch list were encountered at the southern border that we know of. Or they can be drug dealers carrying drugs. Is that correct?
Senator, I'm going to defer questions on the border and the ports of entry to the Department of Homeland Security.
So the DEA has no view on whether drug dealers crossing the border carry drugs?
Senator, as I said, from our investigations, what we see is that the majority of fentanyl
I didn't ask the majority. I said drug dealers and gotaways are carrying drugs, many of them.
Senator, what we see is mostly what we see is mostly tractor trailers and personal vehicles.
All right, so you're sticking to the talking points closely, and congratulations, it's the Democrat talking points, that the open borders don't matter, that 328,000 or 1.2 million gotaways don't matter. We had 100,000 people die last year of drug overdoses. My sister died of a drug overdose just over a decade ago. This is a crisis, but it is a man-made crisis. This administration made a conscious political decision to open the borders. And one of the results is they have turned Mexican drug cartels into multi-billionaires. In 2018, the amount of money cartels made from human trafficking, according to the New York Times, was $500 million. Now, just from human trafficking, the cartels are making $13 billion a year. Again, according to the New York Times, that's a 2,600% increase. Administrator Milgram, the single best thing that happened to Mexican drug cartels in history was Joe Biden becoming president, opening the border, and making tens of billions of dollars for these vicious criminals. In your judgment, is it a good thing that these cartels now have tens of billions of dollars from human trafficking and drug trafficking?
Senator Cruz, I really appreciate the opportunity to answer your question. And as I have said clearly and will continue to say, there are two cartels in Mexico, the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartel, that are responsible for the devastation that we are seeing on the streets of our country. It is our top operational priority to defeat those two cartels and to stop the fentanyl and methamphetamine that is flooding into our communities.
Would you answer the question I asked? Is it a good thing for them to have tens of billions of dollars now that they didn't have?
Senator, we are doing everything we can.
Okay, you're refusing to answer the question. And this shouldn't be a hard question.
Every amount of money, if I please, if I could finish. I very much understand your point. We believe that the cartels are making billions of dollars on illicit
good or
fentanyl.
bad?
It is a terrible thing.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome to each of the witnesses. Thank you for being here. Dr. Pat, always good to see a fellow Texan. Welcome to D.C. I'll note Chairwoman Cantwell observed that all four of our witnesses are doctors. Reminds me of the scene from the classic comedy Spies Like Us, doctor, 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 doctor. So welcome, doctors. Dr. Mulligan, no one wants higher drug prices, and I think we need to look for creative solutions to lower them. But with every legislative solution, we got to consider the trade-offs. especially when our solution is to grant additional authority to a government agency to regulate in a particular market. Government regulation can create substantial compliance costs. It can also create barriers to entry for competitors in a market. This bill imposes both contractual disclosure requirements, meaning it tells PBMs they must share data on how much they pay providers and manufacturers for each drugs, and it also prohibits things like clawbacks and spread pricing. Dr. Mulligan, one argument for the bill is that there's too much consolidation among PBMs right now. We've heard that argument made this morning. In your analysis of the bill, could the bill's requirement lead to more or less market consolidation of PBMs? Please turn your microphone on.
It could lead to more. We doctors maybe should try not to do no harm. The regulations generally, they disproportionately burden the small businesses, and this bill doesn't have any exemption for smaller businesses. And the vertical integration that's been described is especially problematic with respect to this bill because the requirements are going to be telling the bigger PBMs, how much does your left hand pay to your right hand? Well, they could just answer that any way that pleases the FTC. It doesn't really matter. What's going to matter is for the smaller companies.
So I want to follow up on the question. So you're saying it would be beneficial if you want to avoid market consolidation for the bill to have some sort of exemption for smaller PBMs. Is that?
It'd be better not to have the bill, but the bill with an exemption for smaller businesses, like we do so with so many other regulations, would be an improvement.
Okay, that's helpful. If this bill was enacted into law, based on your economic analysis, how would it impact drug prices for the average American?
300 million plus Americans are in insurance, and insurance companies, they are the benefit managers, or they hire people to do the benefit management for them, and that's what they want. They want lower prices and better utilization. And you're undermining that activity, and so drug prices will go up. I estimate just the pharmacy part alone could add to premiums about $10 billion a year in aggregate.
So explain how that is for someone at home who's watching this. Look, we've all been in a situation where you're paying too much, you're frustrated, you're dealing with the bureaucracy, and it pisses you off. Explain what you believe would be the negative consequences of this bill for a consumer at home that wants high-quality health care, high-quality pharmaceuticals at an affordable price. If I understand you correctly, you're concerned this bill would be counterproductive for that.
That's right. We have pharmacy companies and manufacturers who have market power. And the best way consumers have been able to deal with that is to join these buyers clubs, like they do with Costco. And now you're going to undermine the one tool they've had to try to create some competition in that space by burdening the very companies whose job it is and who have successfully gotten lower prices for the consumers.
So if you're correct that this bill would hurt patients by driving up costs, typically when one group is being hurt in the economy, somebody else is doing better. So if consumers would lose money, who would get the money? Who makes out well under this bill?
Well, it's not a zero-sum game, so the winners actually gain less than the losers from this bill. But the winners are the manufacturers. There'll be less competition among manufacturers.
So like Big Pharma?
Big Pharma, and the pharmacy companies.
So your testimony is this bill benefits Big Pharma and allows them to make more money. Is that right?
Yes, and the report I put in the record has a numerical estimate to that effect, yes.
And based on your analysis of the legislation, what do you calculate would be the additional cost to the federal government if this bill passed?
I still have to see how Chairwoman Khan interprets some of these words in the bill, but easily $10 billion a year to the federal deficit, maybe $40 billion a year, maybe more.
So over 10 years, you're talking somewhere between $100 billion to $400 billion in cost to the taxpayers?
Yes, it's in the ballpark of that rebate rule that was scored by OACT and CBO.
Wow. Okay, thank you, sir.
Senator Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to each of the witnesses. Many judges across the country follow a straightforward mode of constitutional interpretation that is looking to the original public meaning of constitutional language. Original public meaning posits that the object of interpretation is the constitutional or statutory text as reasonably understood by the American people at the time of the provision's enactment. The ERA resolution was passed out of Congress in 1972, and it had a clear and unambiguous deadline. Every person in this room understands what that deadline was. And in 1972, every person understood it as well. In this Congress, I've reintroduced legislation that did not pass in the preceding Congress. I'm quite confident Chairman Durbin has reintroduced legislation in this Congress that did not pass in the previous Congress. Why do we have to do that? Because there's a deadline. When the previous Congress expired, legislation you introduced in the previous Congress is no longer before the Congress. Now, it's not only those of us in the room who understood the deadline to mean what the deadline actually says. In 1978, Congress passed a resolution extending the ratification deadline until 1982. If the original deadline wasn't valid, there would have been no need to extend it to 1982. And even judges who don't subscribe to originalism acknowledge the obvious reality. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a trailblazing advocate, said the following about the Equal Rights Amendment in 2019, quote, "The ERA fell 3 states short of ratification. I hope someday it will be put back in the political hopper, starting over again, collecting the necessary number of states to ratify it." Professor Foley, what was the Corwin Amendment?
Corwin Amendment was an amendment that would have basically prohibited Congress from, or the states from, well, Congress specifically, from messing with slavery.
And are there states that have attempted to rescind their earlier approval of the Corwin Amendment?
Yes, several.
So Maryland in 2014, Illinois in 2022?
Mm-hmm.
It would seem that legislators from those states, Illinois in particular, want to have their cake and eat it too. On one hand, they want to say, in the ERA context, that a state cannot rescind its previous ratification. But at the same time, they want to be able to rescind their own ratification and conclude that doing so is perfectly permissible when it concerns a different topic, when it concerns slavery. Are those two positions consistent?
Don't seem consistent to me.
Professor Foley, have other constitutional amendments contained deadlines?
Sure. Every constitutional amendment since the 18th Amendment has contained a deadline, except for the 19th, which is gender voting rights.
So 8 of the last 9 amendments have had deadlines?
Yes.
Is there Supreme Court precedent that deals with Congress's ability to include a deadline when it provides instructions for ratification?
Yeah, absolutely. Dillon v. Gloss and Coleman versus Miller.
Ms. Braceras, good to see you. Welcome. You and I were
Nice to see
classmates
you,
in law
Senator.
school. Good to see you. Let me ask you, when the original version of the ERA was introduced, what was the state of the law concerning discrimination against women, and what protections are there to protect women against discrimination today?
It was very different. When it was introduced in the House first in 1971, and at that point the Supreme Court had not yet decided Reed versus Reed, which is the famous case brought by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg that established that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibits government from treating similarly situated men and women differently. So that had not been decided. when the ERA was first introduced. There were a lot of other things, laws that had not been passed to protect women. Pregnancy
So there are today vigorous protections against gender discrimination. And let me ask you.
Both constitutional and statutory.
Since my time has expired, let me just ask you, what are some of the potential consequences for American society if the ERA were ratified now into the Constitution?
Well, I think one very important thing is that the meaning of the word sex was quite clear in 1971. Today, there are many people who are trying to argue that the word sex also includes gender identity. And so,
Including the Supreme Court in Bostock.
Right. So if the ERA were to be passed today, it would open up a whole host of areas to private women's spaces to men who identify as women.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Concerned Women of America concerning this amendment.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony. It's been powerful. Ms. Allison in particular, I want to thank you for your courage coming and speaking up. I'm sorry about the loss of your mom. That's very difficult, and you're sharing the story of your young children and what they're going through is really powerful and moving, and so thank you for giving voice to their fears, their concerns. Thank you also for giving voice. There are other moms from East Palestine who are here with you and standing with you, and thank you for speaking for them as well. I wanted to ask you, we're still relatively early in the aftermath of the derailment, but at least to date, are you satisfied with the response you've seen, number one, from the federal government, and number two, from Norfolk Southern? Do you feel that the families who've been impacted by this have received what you need, have received the compensation you deserve? And if you're not satisfied, what more do you think is needed?
I would say there's always room for improvement, and this is something that, at least in our community, we never expected it to happen here. I would say that there has been some response, but specifically in regards to Norfolk Southern, I do think there are a lot of opportunities for improvements, at least from a lot of the community members. And I just shared my experience, but I do have testimonies from about 50 other residents with me today that I can share with you. I was reading those last night in my hotel room and just tears streaming down my face. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I'm a market researcher by trade, and so looking at all of this data in the aggregate, what I saw time and time again was people were saying essentially they feel like Norfolk Southern is just offering breadcrumbs throughout the community with funding. So right now, for people that don't feel safe at home, we did receive a flyer that said that you could leave the community for the time being if you wanted to re-evacuate, and some people have chosen to do that. However, there's not clear guidelines of what is going to be paid for and what's not. And so when people go to the assistance center, some people are having a good experience, and then some people are really being questioned about, why do you feel like you should leave? Why do you feel like you need this money from us? And really feeling interrogated. And so that's really concerning, because I think a lot more data needs to come out. This testing that the EPA finally said that they're testing for dioxins, et cetera. That's really good, but there's so much data that needs to come out there. And again, a couple of things. One, you can make the data look however you want. And also, two, you can test or not test for whatever you want. So I think from a community perspective, we just want to make sure that everything is being tested that should be tested. And we're not really sure if that's being done or not. So I would say we're just really, everybody loves living in East Palestine, and we would like to stay there, but only if it's safe. And so there's a lot of confusion in the community about whether long-term, if it's a good choice to stay or not.
Well, I'm certain you mentioned the 50 statements you had, I'm certain that the chair would love to have you submit those statements for the record for the committee, and I'm sure members on both sides of the aisle would like to see those statements. One one of the things you testified about is the concerns about the drop in home values. And I can understand that being a very real concern. You mentioned you've done work as a market researcher. Are there any data that are actually quantifying what the loss in home values has been? And if so, at this point, are the residents being offered any compensation? Is Norfolk Southern offering to make residents whole for the loss in home values? If a family decides that they want to move, are families able to sell their homes? Are there any buyers? Or, I mean, one of the things you said powerfully is even if we want to leave, we can't leave. Is there any relief being offered now to say, if you make the decision to move your home and to move your family somewhere else, there is an avenue for you to sell your home and get a fair market price for it?
The short answer is, as of today, no. There is not clear-cut explanation or parameters of how you would do that. We've heard time and time again from Norfolk Southern that they're going to make it right and that they're looking into some long-term healthcare monitoring and assistance and home value protection, but details of that plan have not been disclosed to residents as of today.
I would encourage for you to let this committee know as it goes forward if there are residents who are looking to move and can't sell their homes. This committee is very interested in making sure that the community of East Palestine is treated fairly and that what you're going through, you receive what is just. And so I would invite you to provide this committee with the specifics so that we can expedite and facilitate making it right.
Thank you.
We are going to get to the second panel, but Senator Welch, did you have a question?
Just briefly, this is really very moving. You know, listening to Ms. Allison, small communities have something that's really very, very special. It's trust. You trust one another. And there's been a breach of trust here. One of the biggest beneficiaries of the trust in a community like yours, and we have many like yours in Vermont, one of the biggest beneficiaries is Norfolk Southern. They can roll their 2 to 3 mile trains through there without anybody asking a question because you trust them to do the right thing. And they didn't do the right thing. And they had the opportunity to do the right thing, but they made other priorities, stock buybacks in the billions, shortening crews, doing the things that a mom would never do to take a shortcut to provide that security, like to your 7-year-old. And the heart of the discussion here is whether, as a result of the breach of trust by a very large and very powerful, very wealthy corporation, your government, it is your government, should step in to restore justice to you and your fellow citizens. And that's what this hearing is about. Will government step up to provide physical, emotional, and health security as a result of this, just like it would if there was a military threat to our country, where government has got to be on the side of folks like you and your neighbors. So I'm very grateful to you, feel very badly at that breach of trust, because, you know, that trust gets you through hard times. You don't even complain because you know your neighbor's got your back. Well, you have to know the government's got your back. We admire you. This is going to go on for some time, as Governor DeWine said. But I think all of us in this legislation are going to do our level best to respond to you and your neighbors and what you're going through. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Welch. And again, thank you to our colleagues, to Governor DeWine, to Ms. Allison. Thank you for a very compelling testimony. We'll now move to the second panel.
Get here for our committee hearing.
I appreciate it very
All
much.
right.
And having
Thank
served with you for a long time, I know that you are quite capable of a wonderful filibuster.
Thank you.
I am sure we heard the virtues of the great state of Minnesota.
Yes, and our highest voter turnout, which is higher than Texas. And the only thing you have on us is a bigger state fair, but that's only because you're open for 30 days. We actually have the bigger state fair, but continue on, Senator Cruz.
I might disagree, but I'll pick a different forum for that discussion. Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone. Every American wants election processes that they can trust and that are neutrally applied. When secretaries of state or even state Supreme Courts contravene their own laws in order to skew election rules towards preferred political outcomes, this undermines the public faith in the democratic process. One such area for this is voter ID. According to Forbes, 81% of Americans support voter ID, including 62% of Democrats. Voter ID, I believe, should be a basic minimum requirement for a free and fair election. And yet, voter ID right now is opposed on a partisan basis by virtually every Democrat in Congress and by a great many Democrat secretaries of state. Secretary Oliver, you have been vocal on this topic. You told the Albuquerque Journal, quote, "I support policies that ensure the integrity of our elections. New Mexico requires voters to provide personal identifier information when voting in person, with increased ID requirements for absentee voting. Photo voter ID laws, however, can make it harder for some communities to vote. I don't support this policy." According to the numbers I just cited from Forbes, 81% of Americans and 62% of Democrats support photo ID for voting. Why is it that the policy you embrace is different from the policy that a majority of New Mexicans want to see?
Thank you for the question, Senator. In my position as Secretary of State, first of all, I don't make the laws in the state of New Mexico, but I do have a bully pulpit in which to espouse my viewpoint. As 16 years being an election administrator in my state, there are communities for which having some physical form of ID, and of course it looks different in every state, states that do require physical photo ID in order to vote. In some states, there's a wide variety of such photos that can be used. In some, it's much more limited. Obviously, states that have a wide variety of voter IDs available, that's, I think, personally a better policy. But in my state, there are communities where even getting a tribal, for example, we have a lot of tribal voters in my state. 12% of my state is Native American. Many tribal IDs do not contain a photo. They're not necessarily issued in the same way that we understand photo ID to be issued.
Madam Secretary, with respect, states can address that, and many states, like the state of Texas, provide for a zero-cost photo ID for voting. I will say the polling also shows over 60% of African Americans support photo ID. I will say the argument that minorities can't get photo ID, I think is condescending. I'm Hispanic. I know how to get a driver's license. I have heard from many in minority communities that getting a photo ID is not an onerous requirement. And I'll point out that your website indicates, quote, "A physical form of identification is only required for first-time New Mexico voters who registered by mail and did not include identification with their voter registration application form. Otherwise," the website continues, "the only identification needed to vote is, quote, a verbal or written statement of identification including a name, year of birth, and registered address." So you don't even require a date of birth, just a birth year. So in about 30 seconds, you can attain enough information about someone to allow you to steal their vote. Madam Secretary, do you know the name Harris Hartz?
Senator, that name is vaguely familiar to me.
Well,
I don't remember.
Harris Hartz is a judge, a federal judge on the 10th Circuit who sits in Albuquerque. And in 2017, Judge Hartz went to vote. And he was barred from voting when the Albuquerque city clerk's record showed that somebody else had already voted under his name. This is a federal judge in New Mexico, but you just needed his name and year of birth, which was pretty easy to find. He ended up ultimately having to vote. He was initially denied the right to vote. Ultimately, he was given the ability to vote on a provisional vote. Before voting, he presented his driver's license to the voting center staff. And after an investigation of the fraudulent ballot, Judge Hartz said, quote, the signature was nowhere near mine, and it didn't even look like Harris Hartz. does it concern you when federal judges are having their votes stolen in New Mexico because there's not a photo ID requirement?
Senator, I remember this issue now. This was a mistake made by a poll worker. That's what happened. And that mistakes can be made by poll workers even when a physical ID is shown.
But what was the mistake?
The poll worker brought up the incorrect record, they brought up Mr. Judge Hartz's record as opposed to the individual who was casting the ballot. Neither the poll worker nor the voter noticed the discrepancy, and a mistake was made. And so when Judge Hartz came to vote, there was an investigation into what exactly happened. So it wasn't that the individual was attempting to steal Judge Hartz's vote. It was that there was a clerical error that was made. And clerical errors do get made in elections. They're regrettable, but they do.
And I think we should protect everyone's right to vote. And I agree with 81% of Americans that photo ID requirements protect the integrity of our elections and protect your right to vote, my right to vote, and even federal judges' rights to vote. Thank you.
Okay.
You. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to each of the witnesses who are here today. Chief Comstock, please, thank you for your service, and please express my gratitude to the men and women who were first responders, who were there when this horrific tragedy occurred, and thank you for their courage and the difference that each of them makes in the community. Chair Homendy, let me thank you also for the professional way in which the NTSB has approached this accident. I think you have been a truth teller. I think you have managed to avoid politics and focus on the substance of what caused this accident and how we can prevent it. And so it's not that often that we get to thank a public official for doing a good and effective job. I think you provided also some helpful suggestions in your testimony that I'm certain the committee will look closely at the specific suggestions you put forward. As I look at what caused this derailment, there are a number of factors, but one factor that from the early reports stands out is the hotbox detectors. We now know that the terrain derailed past 3 hotbox detectors prior to the derailment. 30 miles away, the reading was 38 degrees above ambient temperature. Then 20 miles away, it had risen to 103 degrees above ambient temperature, so it had risen dramatically. And then just prior to the derailment, it was 253 degrees above ambient temperature, reflecting that the bearing had locked and derailment was imminent. Mr. Shaw, why did this trend in temperature not trigger an alert earlier to stop the train? And in particular, why were you not able to stop the train after the second reading had gone from 38 degrees above ambient temperature to 103 degrees above ambient temperature?
Senator, thank you for that question. I'll note that the NTSB report indicated that the crew did nothing wrong, and we certainly thank them for that. The hotbox detectors were working as designed, and there were no track defects. Since the derailment and the preliminary results of the NTSB report, we led the rail industry, and the rail industry has also implemented implementation of far more hotbox detectors across our network. We're adding 200 hotbox detectors on our network to reduce the spacing between our hotbox detectors. Our hotbox detectors are already spaced amongst the lowest in the industry, and I think Mr. Jeffries had indicated that the entire industry was adding about 1,000 hotbox detectors.
Mr. Shaw, perhaps you didn't hear my question, so let me ask it again. The first hotbox measured 38 degrees above ambient temperature. As I understand, the ambient temperature was about 20 degrees, so that was roughly 58 degrees. 10 miles later, the second hotbox measured 103 degrees above ambient temperature. That's an increase of over 60 degrees in 10 miles. Why did Norfolk Southern not stop the train then and examine the bearing to make sure that it didn't melt the axle and that you didn't have a derailment? If you'd stopped then, it would have prevented the derailment. So my question is, why did the second hotbox reading not trigger action?
Senator, my understanding is that that second reading was still below our alarm threshold, which is amongst the lowest in the industry. In response to this, the industry has agreed to work together to share best practices with respect to hotbox detectors, trending technology, and thresholds.
So when you and I visited my office yesterday, you said your threshold is now 170 degrees above ambient temperature. As I understand it, at the time of the derailment, your threshold was 200 degrees above ambient temperature. So you're right, 103 was not 200 degrees. As you and I discussed, I've spoken with your competitors, other Class 1 railroads who have indicated that trending technology and algorithms can measure significant changes in temperature, and in particular can flag that when it goes from 38 degrees to 103 degrees, you need to stop and take a look at it. Mr. Jeffries, let me ask you in terms of how other railroads handle it. What is the technology that is available to spot this problem before it's gotten so bad that a derailment is imminent?
Well, thank you for that, and that's a spot-on question, and that's one of the three things we're focused on as in the industry. So one is the physical deployment of approximately 1,000 additional detectors. Two is creating the industry standard of 170 degrees as a critical threshold. And the third one is really looking at industry best practices to examine and potentially adopt new algorithms for trending detection so that if there is a dramatic spike in temperature, even though it may be below that absolute threshold, it's caught. And so we've brought the entire industry together, and over the next month we'll be reporting out, okay, what can we learn from each other, and what are the best practices we can adopt, and what other steps need to be taken based on the information we have and the predictive analytics we can put into place.
And if I could ask one final question, Mr.
Whitaker was trying to weigh in there. I don't know if you
Mr. Whitaker, sure. I didn't see that, but sure, I would welcome you.
Thanks for acknowledging Senator Cruz. I'd like to just make note that trending defect detector technology, from being in the cab of a locomotive, when we pass a defect detector, it trends to an office like Norfolk Southern in Atlanta, Georgia. It doesn't convey to the railroad crews, which is a problem in this incident as well as many others that still continue to this day. What we need as a train crew, which they say they listen, they haven't been listening for quite a while. We need to be notified whenever these trending detectors are seeing this car trend hotter. That way we can keep a better eye on it, or even stop, inspect that rail car.
Sure.
But as it stands right now, even after East Palestine, it's all about moving the train. That's all PSR is. That's all they care about. So right now, they tell the train crew to stop your train, set your brakes in a full service application, then release. And hopefully that releases whatever the case may be. When the safest cause case should be, we stop and go back and inspect. That's what the conductor is there for. That's why a two-person crew is essential.
So that's very helpful. So you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, that having real-time reporting of what the sensors are showing for the conductor, the engineer, would be helpful. Mr. Jeffries, are there technological barriers? Are there impediments to giving the crew real-time reporting of what's happening?
So I can't get into the technicalities of that, but I will say one thing we are focused on with any sort of regulatory requirement on wayside detectors themselves is that we do need to be given the opportunity to evolve our technology, because continuous onboard detection is the next phase of sensors and detection. And so certainly that's something we're interested in and interested in further deploying and further developing.
Well, as we're drafting this legislation, I would ask you to please, if there are technological issues we should know about, please let us know, because I have to say what Mr. Whitaker said there makes a lot of sense to me. And if there's a reason it's not yet feasible, we need to know about it, because that seems to me a reasonable element for legislation. Mr. Whitaker, yes, my time's gone, but go ahead, Mr. Whitaker.
I apologize. I do think it's very important to shed some light on this. It is feasible. The technology is there. Several days after East Palestine, we almost had a similar incident in Cleveland area on Norfolk Southern. The crew, the defect detector said no defects to the crew. The train dispatcher came on and said, hey, we have a report of a trending defect detector on the train. We need you to stop and inspect it. Immediately after that, the chief dispatcher, which is the person that controls the whole railroad, told them to keep going. If it were not for an eastbound train passing them and instructing them, hey, your train's on fire.
Wow.
Stop your train. And we set that car out. They had to walking speed this car 5 miles. So the technology is there. They're just raising and lowering their thresholds to move freight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's clear that for too long, the rail industry has been raking in profits and putting safety on the sidelines. Mr. Whitaker, do you agree that the East Palestine derailment
been a very important job? You're the number 2 person in the Department of Justice. Every U.S. attorney reports to you. The U.S. Marshals report to you. You are responsible for day-to-day operations of the Department of Justice, and in particular, the criminal justice aspects of the Department of Justice. Is all of that correct?
That's correct.
It is unfortunate, Ms. Monaco, that as you look back over the last 2.5 years, this Department of Justice, I believe, has been the most partisan Department of Justice we've ever seen. And that is directly contrary to the mission of DOJ. DOJ is meant to be nonpartisan. It is meant to enforce the law, regardless of party. I had hopes that Merrick Garland would actually do that when he was confirmed. Those hopes have been shattered. You have been a loyal deputy standing alongside that partisan corruption of Department of Justice. You have been willing to devote massive resources to targeting individuals that are perceived to be political opponents of the White House. And you have been willing to devote zero resources to protecting individuals who are perceived to be political opponents of the White House. I want to ask you about a statute you've been asked about already, 18 U.S.C. 1507. You're familiar with this statute?
Yes.
It's a criminal statute that says whoever with the intent of influencing any judge pickets or parades in or near a building or residences occupied or used by such judge shall be fined or imprisoned under this title or imprisoned not more than 1 year or both. Now, the entire country has seen hundreds of protesters outside the homes of Supreme Court justices night after night after night. You turn on your TV and you see violations of this criminal statute over and over and over again. How many prosecutions has DOJ brought under 18 U.S.C. Section 1507 under your leadership?
There have been no prosecutions under 1507. We're pursuing an attempted murder case against an individual who
Zero is
threatened
the answer.
Justice Kavanaugh.
I'm quite aware, and you're responsible for that, allowing these protests night after night after night. The violent threat of homicide of the individual who traveled across the country attempting to murder a Supreme Court justice, that was fueled by DOJ refusing to enforce this statute. Now, it's not an accident that DOJ refused to enforce this statute. The U.S. Marshals gave a presentation. The General Counsel's Office of the U.S. Marshals, if you look at one of the pages from that presentation, the General Counsel's Office stated the goals of the Residential and Personal Protection Mission: keep SCOTUS justices and their family free from physical harm, do not interfere with lawful First Amendment protected activity, avoid, unless absolutely necessary, criminal enforcement actions involving the protesters, particularly on public space, and making arrests and initiating prosecutions is not the goal of the Marshal's presence at SCOTUS residences. Are you familiar with this presentation?
I am. I'm familiar with the fact that the U.S. Marshal Service Director has been explicit, has been clear that the Attorney General has repeatedly directed him to enforce all federal laws, including 1507, and that his #1 priority, and that of his many deputies assigned to a 24/7 security presence, is to protect the life, the safety, the property of the justices and
Did you or
their
anyone
family.
from the DAG's office meet with the U.S. Marshal Service and discuss Section 1507?
I regularly meet with the Director of the Marshal Service, the
And
Attorney
have you
General.
discussed 1507?
I discussed the Attorney General has been quite clear, and I have been quite clear with the Director of the Marshal Service. The
Are
Attorney
you familiar with
General's-
this presentation?
I've seen those slides, if they're the ones that Senator Britt presented to the Attorney General. But I want to be quite clear, Senator, about the direction given to the Marshal Service through the Director of the Marshal Service. He has been clear that the Attorney General directed him repeatedly to enforce all federal laws, to
With
make
respect,
his
Ms.
number
Monaco,
one
that
priority.
is demonstrably false, because this is written instruction. Making arrests and initiating prosecution is not the goal. That's not an instruction to enforce the law. That is exactly the opposite. It is 180 degrees. It is instructing them. It is not the goal to arrest anybody, despite the fact that the criminal statute said they shall be imprisoned. You made a political decision, Merrick Garland made a political decision, that because you agree with the protesters, you don't like the decision the Supreme Court justices made, the marshals were instructed, don't arrest anyone and don't enforce federal law. Isn't that correct?
That is not correct, because the Attorney General and I and the Marshal Service Director are so concerned about potential threats to the justices. The Attorney General directed in an unprecedented step, 24/7.
Not what this says in writing.
24/7.
What does this say in writing?
I don't have the right glasses on for that, but Senator, the Attorney General was very clear with the Director of the Marshal Service, and the Marshal Service Director has said the same thing.
The word
that
not is even underlined.
The number one priority given to the Marshal Service for their unprecedented protection detail for the Supreme Court justices is to protect their life, their
But
safety,
to
and
ignore
their property.
1507.
To protect their life, their
To
safety.
ignore federal criminal law.
Respectfully disagree with that characterization.
That's what the written instruction says. Not is underlined. Do not make arrests. Do not initiate prosecutions. Up is not down.
The Director of the Marshal Service has been very clear. The Attorney General directed him to enforce all federal laws, but that his number one priority is to ensure the safety.
Ms. Monaco,
and the
what you're
protection.
saying is objectively false.
Time of the senator has expired. There are no further.
The attack that my Democrat colleagues breathlessly repeat is that Clarence Thomas stayed at the vacation home of a very close friend of his, a successful Texas businessman, flew on his plane, and went on his yacht. Well, if that's the standard, going and traveling and being paid for by others, then guess what? Just about every Supreme Court justice has done so, and done so in much greater numbers. Justice Thomas was appointed in 1991. In the time since then, he's taken 109 reported trips, 5 international trips. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed in 1993, 2 years later. In the time she was on the court, she took 157 trips, including 28 international trips. Mr. Payne, yes or no, do you think Ruth Bader Ginsburg was corrupt?
No.
Nor do I. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not alone. Justice Stephen Breyer, appointed the year later in 1994, took 233 reported trips, including 63 international trips. Again, yes or no, Mr. Payne, do you think Stephen Breyer was corrupt?
No.
Nor do I. I would point out Justice Kagan has done the same thing, Justice Sotomayor has done the same thing, and yet none of my Democrat colleagues care, because this is a political attack directed at a justice they hate. And by the way, let's spend a moment focusing on Justice Stephen Breyer, a delightful human being, someone I know personally, someone who served decades on the court. Justice Stephen Breyer repeatedly traveled on the penny of a prominent Democratic billionaire, the Pritzker family. Now, J.B. Pritzker is the Democrat governor of the state of Illinois, from which our chairman hails. I would be shocked if the chairman of this committee has not had multiple meals with the Pritzker family. Justice Breyer was a longtime member of the board that awarded the Pritzker Architecture Prize. Now, what did that mean? That meant Justice Breyer traveled on the dime of these Democrat billionaires. In 2019, Justice Breyer traveled to New York City, to Vancouver, and Paris. In 2018, Justice Breyer traveled to Ireland and Spain. In 2016, he traveled to New York, Spain, and France. In 2013, he traveled to Norway, Sweden, Denmark. In 2012, he traveled to Beijing and to London. All of this paid for by the Pritzker Foundation. Now, none of my Democrat colleagues are mad about this, and let me be clear. I'm not suggesting Justice Breyer is corrupt. What I'm suggesting is this committee is corrupt because this is a kangaroo circus, and I will note we had 15 Senate Democrats, including 6 members of this committee, send a letter to the Appropriations Committee threatening to cut off the funding for security at the Supreme Court. The left is willing to threaten the lives of the justices.
Senator Cruz. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crittenbrink, you and I have spoken several times about my concerns that the Biden administration has been consistently weak on China, and in particular weak in supporting Taiwan. One area we have discussed multiple times is this administration's continued prohibition on our Taiwanese allies from displaying symbols of their sovereignty on American soil. And you know the history of this policy. It was the Obama administration that first implemented the policy at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party. When President Trump became president, I spent 4 years battling the Trump administration, urging them to change the policy. And finally, at the end of the administration, I was successful. And the State Department changed the policy to allow Taiwan to do what all of our other allies can do, which is to appear on U.S. soil, to appear on U.S. government properties with Taiwanese flags, wearing Taiwanese military uniforms. When President Biden became president and he nominated Tony Blinken to be Secretary of State, I asked Mr. Blinken about this question before this committee. And Secretary Blinken committed at the time to keep the policy in place, quote, for the time being. It turned out that phrase for the time being meant just enough time for him to get confirmed and get in office, because shortly after he got there, he reversed the policy. He returned to the same appeasement of the Chinese Communist Party that had prevailed under the Obama administration. And I have to say it occurred at a particularly bad time when China is engaging in more and more aggressive and bellicose actions towards Taiwan. Now, at your confirmation hearing, I asked you about this. And you committed to this committee, and I quote, you said, quote, "I am committed in every way to growing our partnership in Taiwan." Now, every way presumably includes allowing the Taiwanese to display their flags, their uniforms, their symbols of sovereignty. Has the State Department done so, and if not, why?
Senator Cruz, thank you for your question. Respectfully, I would say, Senator, that the U.S. government's policy related to symbols of sovereignty, that policy and those restrictions have been in place since the very beginning of the implementation of our One China policy and our unofficial partnership.
With respect, that's not true, because the Trump State Department reversed them and allowed Taiwan to display the symbols of sovereignty.
But Senator, these were not new policies that came about in the Obama administration. These are restrictions that from the very beginning.
Is it true the Trump administration reversed the policy?
It is true that near the end of the Trump administration, the contact guidelines that have traditionally guided U.S. government interaction with Taiwan were rescinded.
So the policy was they could display their symbols of sovereignty, and then the Biden administration came in and acquiesced once again to the Chinese communists. And I will point out this view is not an esoteric view. I have not once but twice introduced legislation to allow the Taiwanese to display their symbols of sovereignty, and this committee has passed that legislation with an overwhelming bipartisan vote multiple times. So if you have Democrats and Republicans on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee telling the State Department, respect the Taiwanese and treat them as allies, why does the Biden State Department refuse to follow that guidance?
Senator, since 1979, we have not had formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Taiwan is an important but unofficial partner with whom we have an incredibly robust relationship. I would argue.
All right, let me ask let me ask a different question.
Senator, if I could just.
No, I want to ask another aspect.
I would argue,
my time is
Senator,
running out.
that our partnership with Taiwan has never been stronger. We have.
All right, well, let me give another example then, Mr. Crittenbeck.
Yes, sir.
Another area where I am very concerned concerns Taiwan's participation in the International Civil Aviation Organization. Last Congress, I authored legislation, which became law with bipartisan support, requiring the administration to formulate and transmit a strategy for securing Taiwan's inclusion in ICAO. We saw, particularly during the COVID pandemic, with the incredible number of flights going through Taiwan, that it was asinine not to include discussions with Taiwan. It should be a no-brainer. Taiwan is a global hub for civil aviation. Well, the State Department recently transmitted that report. I have it in my hand here. Without being unkind, it doesn't approach remotely the urgency of the issue that the legislation required. So I want to ask you, what is State Department's specific, concrete, strategic plan to secure Taiwan's participation in the International Civil Aviation Organization?
Senator, we agree with you that Taiwan ought to participate meaningfully, not just in ICAO, but in many other international institutions, given Taiwan's important role in global affairs and global economy. I'll have to take back your question on our specific strategy for doing so, but I hope our position is clear. And just one.
So by statute, it should have been in this report, and it's not.
I'm happy to take that back and take a look at that, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Today, we're going to be voting on 6 bills and Coast Guard promotions for 315 mid-grade officers. I'm grateful to Chair Cantwell and her staff for working with me and my staff to move several bipartisan bills in this markup. There are three bills I want to briefly mention. First, I'm pleased that we're going to be marking up the Trank Research Act of 2023, which I introduced along with Senator Welch. The drug epidemic continues to ravage communities in Texas and across the country. And to protect our citizens, we need to work swiftly to prevent deadly new drugs like Trank and the truly horrifying side effects that come with it. This bill would improve our knowledge of these devastating drugs so that law enforcement and others on the front line of this battle have better information about when Trank shows up in a community. Secondly, I'm also pleased that we'll be marking up 2 bills that will help the people of Texas by modernizing the nation's weather communications and radio service. I was glad to join Senator Cantwell in introducing the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act and the National Weather Service Communications Improvement Act. When severe storms take out communication systems in Texas and other states, we need reliable hazard communication systems to inform them about how to stay safe. Now, turning to the Railway Safety Act. This bill was introduced in the aftermath of the shocking derailment of a Norfolk Southern train in East Palestine, Ohio. All of us were moved by the testimony of the witnesses. I found particularly moving the testimony of a resident from East Palestine, Miss Misty Allison. At the time of the hearing, I made clear to Norfolk Southern that we expected that they would pay for the damage that was caused to the residents of East Palestine and the surrounding areas, that it was not their fault, and the railroad had an obligation to make them whole. I was pleased to announce yesterday that Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw signed a letter committing to me and committing to this committee in writing to compensate homeowners near the derailment site for the reduction in their property values. Norfolk Southern committed to establish a fund that will make whole those residents who sell their homes for less than the pre-derailment appraised value. I thank Norfolk Southern for making that commitment. We will be holding them to that commitment, but that is major progress for ensuring justice for the homes and the families injured by that horrific derailment. Since the derailment, my colleague, Senator Vance, has been an indispensable voice for rural Ohioans, and I applaud his commitment to his constituents.
In March, Senator Vance joined Senator Brown in introducing the bill that is before us today. I said at our hearing later that month that my staff and I would work diligently towards an agreement on policies that improve safety and protect communities, while at the same time not damaging our supply chain or imposing unreasonable costs that would ultimately make products more expensive for families. We all recognize this bill has changed since it was introduced. It's gone from 18 pages to a substitute that's nearly 80 pages long. I earnestly hope that we would reach a bipartisan consensus. And I applaud the substantial work by Senator Cantwell, Senator Vance, and their staff that's gone into this bill. They are to be commended for their efforts and their passion. But unfortunately, at this stage, I cannot support the result. I remain concerned that this bill is overly and needlessly prescriptive in certain places. In particular, I worry that these numerous new rulemakings and authorities empower Secretary Buttigieg and the Biden administration to further and aggressively restrict the movement of American energy products. The many regulatory requirements of this bill would always carry some risk of harm to our supply chain and increased cost to American consumers. I think that was a trade many of us were willing to make for improved rail safety. But without sufficient guide rails in the hands of overzealous Biden bureaucrats, the bill's new mandates in this bill would make it much easier for this administration to restrict the transportation of coal, of oil, of natural gas, and of ethanol. And the burdens on moving these commodities would carry over to the many other trains in the rail network that carry crops and building materials and cars to market. That means more time and costs to deliver everything from industrial chemicals to orange juice. With these potential consequences in mind, I'm very concerned about giving broad authority to the Biden administration to write these new rules. Without guardrails in place, such as a clear requirement for the prescriptive rulemakings to be cost-effective, President Biden and Secretary Buttigieg would have a free hand to aggressively restrict the movement of coal, oil, natural gas, ethanol, and other essential commodities that the radical green movement hates. Of course, consumers will still demand these and other commodities, but at some point it becomes too costly to move by rail, and so trucking will become more attractive. The likely result of increasing rail costs and network congestion is the diversion of the shipment of hazardous materials from trains to trucks. Data clearly shows that on average, transportation by truck consumes more fuel, carries a greater risk of an accident with a hazardous material release, and a greater threat to the traveling public than transportation by rail. Last year, there were 355 hazmat spills by rail. That's 355 too many. But there were more than 23,000 hazmat spills by truck. In the current form of this bill, the measure to, quote, improve rail safety may come at the expense of transportation safety overall. Again, I'm disappointed we weren't able to reach agreement on a targeted bipartisan rail safety bill, but I remain hopeful that between now and final passage, we will reach that agreement. I think this bill, as written, it's going to pass this committee, but I don't believe it's as written it is likely to get 60 votes in the Senate, and I think it is even less likely as written to pass the House of Representatives. So I remain committed to working with the authors of this bill and with the chairwoman to find a bill that both enhances safety but also does not result in dramatically driving up the cost of energy for consumers who are being hurt today.
Thank you. I turn to Senator Vance for a motion.
Yeah, so thanks to the Madam Chair and the ranking member.
For statutory changes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Ossoff. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, every day when I'm home in Texas, I hear from Texans who are deeply dismayed about the growing politicization and weaponization of the Department of Justice and the FBI. If you are not, every one of you should be deeply concerned about the damage being done to the integrity of the institutions in which you operate. My office hears regularly from FBI agents and from assistant U.S. attorneys who are likewise concerned about the politicization and weaponization of the Department of Justice and the FBI, and this is profoundly damaging to the rule of law in our nation. Last month, a whistleblower brought to light the existence in the FBI of a report, an FD 1023, in which the informant alleges that President Biden and his family members engaged in a $5 million bribery scheme during his time as vice president. Deputy Director Abate, is it true that the FBI has a report making those allegations?
I'm not going to comment on that, Senator.
And why is that?
I'm just not going to comment on information we received, investigations, or
Do you owe an
ongoing matters.
obligation to the American people to be candid about evidence of corruption by the President of the United States?
This is an area that I'm not going to get into with you, Senator.
Well, I understand you don't want to, and that's why people are mad at the FBI, because you're stonewalling and covering up serious allegations of evidence of corruption from the president. Yesterday, Senator Chuck Grassley stood on the Senate floor and alleged that there are 17 recordings of this informant from Burisma, Ukrainian natural gas company. 15 of them are recordings, voice recordings of him talking to Hunter Biden. 2 of them are voice recordings of him talking to Joe Biden. Deputy Director Abate, does the FBI have 17 voice recordings laying out evidence of a bribery scheme?
Senator, I would add also that we've worked with the House Oversight Committee.
Yeah, this is the
provide
Senate. We're the other
document
side of the Capitol. This is the Senate. Do you have those 17 recordings?
I'm not going to comment on any investigative matters, Senator.
See, that's the problem. The FBI, and I've had this conversation with Chris Wray too, this is why you are damaging the institution. The American people have a right to know whether there is serious, credible evidence that the President of the United States took a $5 million bribe. And by the way, if it's false, Chairman Durbin just rolled his eyes. If Chairman Durbin were interested in the rule of law, we would have a hearing on these allegations. But of course, the Democrats don't want a hearing on these allegations. And to be clear, if the allegations are false, you know who could disprove them? Joe Biden. He could call for this to be released publicly. But the FBI is stonewalling. Would you agree?
Two things, Senator. No
Sure.
one's stonewalling. The 1023
You just said you refused to answer the
was provided
question.
in response to a subpoena.
Okay,
to the
then why'd
House
you refuse
Oversight
to answer
Committee.
my question?
The pertinent information is there, and I reject your assertion that the
Why
FBI
did you
is
refuse to answer my
politicized.
question?
I just answered your question.
Okay, so yes, you have a 1023. Do you have the 17 recordings, yes or no?
I'm not going to get further into that.
So you're stonewalling. You can't say I'm not refusing to answer your question, but I won't answer your question.
I'm going to answer within the parameters that we operate in.
That's the problem. The FBI has right now an unlimited hubris that you believe you are unaccountable. You don't believe you're accountable to the United States Congress, and you don't believe you're accountable to the American people. And you are doing damage. The FBI is a great institution. When I go home to Texas, people ask me, should we abolish the FBI? Now, I tell them no, because you have heroes and patriots working for you that are catching child predators, that are catching terrorists. But you're sitting there happily erecting a wall to protect Joe Biden. Will you provide to this committee, not the House, the Senate Judiciary Committee, will you provide the FD 1023 and will you provide the 17 recordings so we can assess what is the evidence, the specific credible evidence that Joe Biden personally took a $5 million bribe from a foreign national?
Senator, we will work with this committee, you and other members, to provide the information within the parameters of the process.
Will you provide the FD 1023, yes or no?
I will take that back and we will work with our
So you're not
chambers.
answering that. Will you provide the 17 recordings?
We will take that back and we'll work with you.
So you're not answering that either. Did you investigate in any way, shape, or form these allegations?
Senator, once again, I'm not going to comment.
So
on
you're not going to say
investigative-
whether you did your job?
We do our job to the very best of our ability.
Well, not here. You're not answering a single question to the American people. And you may think this is esoteric. I promise you, millions of Americans are concerned. You know who isn't concerned? Not a single Senate Democrat. We're going to go through this whole hearing. Not one Democrat will ask a question about this. You know who else isn't concerned? The corporate media, who is joining with the Democrats in covering up this evidence. If Joe Biden is innocent, the evidence should be made public and demonstrate that he's innocent. But if he is not, is it true this informant who alleged that he personally took a bribe was an informant the FBI had relied upon previously in other investigations? Yes or no?
Senator, in each and every investigation that we have, all the work that we do,
I asked you
the
a yes or no
expectation
question.
is that every logical avenue of investigation be pursued
I asked you a
to
yes
its
or no
fullest.
question. Are you going to answer it?
Yeah, I'm answering your question.
Was the informant one you had relied on previously in other investigations? Yes or no?
Senator, we run down every piece of information, every
You're not
lead,
answering it then. You're refusing to answer it. So you're refusing to answer the
to
question.
the fullest extent possible.
You're refusing to answer the question.
relentlessly,
Is that correct?
aggressively in all instances.
Senator, your
It's
time
disgraceful. It's disgraceful, Deputy Director Abate. Disgraceful.
Senator, your time has expired. Senator Tilts?
Chairman, I think Senator Blackburn goes before me, or Senator Welch. I appreciate the opportunity, but
Thank you, Senator Tillis. It's Senator Welch is next. Cruz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Title IX was a landmark civil rights law. It helped create the incredible breadth of women's sports and girls' sports that we see across the country. I believe in girls' sports. I believe in women's sports. I'm the proud father of 2 daughters who are both athletes. I think participating in competitive sports is a wonderful thing for a young girl. I think it is a wonderful thing for a woman. And I think, unfortunately, today's Democrat Party has decided that women's sports and girls' sports no longer matters, and they're willing to push radical legislation designed to destroy girls' sports and women's sports. Ms. Gaines, I want to thank you for your courage. You are relatively young, but you have demonstrated incredible courage. And because you have dared to speak up, you have been demonized, you have been vilified. I saw when you were attacked by a leftist mob at San Francisco State University for daring to speak up. You had an incredible record as a swimmer at the University of Kentucky. You were a 2-time NCAA All-American. You were a 5-time SEC champion. You're an SEC record holder and a 2-time Olympic trial qualifier. But yet on March 27th, 2022, something changed. What happened on March 17th, 2022?
That's when Thomas and I raced in the 200 freestyle and again resulted in a tie.
And so you tied. What was the consequence of tying?
We went behind the awards podium where typically you're handed your trophy, you're marched out, you're named an All-American. And so we go back there and the official looks at both Thomas and myself and says, "Great job, but you guys tied. And we only have one trophy, therefore we're giving this trophy to Leah." And I question this and I say, why? And at first I shortened it in my testimony, but really he stumbled on his words. He didn't know how to answer this. And at first he's, well, we're just doing this in chronological order. To which I further pressed, and I said, okay, well, what are you being chronological about? Because we tied. And if we're doing this off alphabetical order, G comes before T, so what are you being chronological about? To which this wasn't a script they had prepared for him. And he actually appreciated his honesty. He did say, we have to give the trophy for Leah because Leah has to have it for pictures. They've made that clear. Leah has to have the trophy for pictures. You can pose with this trophy, but you have to give yours back. You have to go home empty-handed. Leah Thomas takes the trophy home, end of story.
Now, let me ask you, as someone who's competed at the elite level, in your experience, is there a difference between women and men?
Of course. I think we learned this at a very young age, watching even 12 and unders play. Going through puberty causes irreversible advantage, that no matter the training, no matter the diet, no matter any alterable change you can make will overcome that male advantage, especially in sports like swimming where lung capacity matters so much. Even something as silly as throat size, men have on average a 40% larger throat, which sounds like it's nothing, but when you're grasping for air, that 40% larger throat makes a huge difference in athletic success, not to mention height. You guys know the differences.
Ms. Robinson, do you agree with Ms. Gaines that there's a difference between women and men?
If the question is about trans women,
I'm just asking, is there a difference between women and men?
I mean, what I can say here is that the NCAA has rules in place. They've had rules in place for the last decade, and when this competition happened,
I'm going to try again.
the rules were clear.
Do you believe there's a difference between women and men? It's a yes/no question. Do you believe there's a difference?
Oh, I think that we're talking about this case with the NCAA.
No, I'm asking a question. Do you believe there's a difference between women and men? Most people could answer this very simply. I'm curious if you're willing to do so.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just putting it into the context of the conversation that we're having. I think that there are definitions related to sex.
Is
but
that
I
a
also
yes?
think
So I'm
that
trying to
when
get a yes or no. I'm not trying to get a speech.
I'm
there a difference between women and men?
I think that there are definitions for biological sex.
Okay, so you're
which
not
is
answering
different
that.
than
Let me ask
gender.
you this question then. Why do women's sports exist? If you can't define a difference between women and men, why not abolish women's sports and just tell little girls to swim with little boys and see who wins?
Oh, I'm simply saying that that sex is
My
different
question,
than gender.
why
and I do believe
why
that
do
women's sports have a great
exist?
value. I mean, Senator, I'll tell you right
Ms.
now.
Robinson, please answer the question I'm asking you.
Absolutely.
Why do women's sports exist?
I think that there are so many positive benefits to sports.
But
I mean,
why have a
we've talked
separate
about it here
category for
today.
women? If there's no difference between women and men, why to have women's sports?
I'm saying that there's a difference between sex and gender, and that the NCAA has rules in place, which they have for the last decade.
Mr. Chairman,
which
I would
determine
like to enter into
related
the
to
record an
participation.
article from Duke Law called Comparing Athletic Performances for the Best Elite Women to Boys and Men. And it goes through examining in 2017 the top records for women in the world in various track and field events. So, for example, in the 100-meter, the top record for women in the world was 10.71 seconds. Now, that record for the number one woman in the world in 2017 was, in the year 2017, broken by 124 boys under 18. In that same year, the record for the number one competing woman in the 100-meter dash in the world was broken by a total of 2,474 men. If the radical Democrat agenda to destroy girls' sports and women's sports succeeds, little girls will not have a chance to compete. So I ask unanimous consent that this article be entered into the record.
Without objection. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Colleagues, a recent
statement. Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Sullivan. Admiral Fagan, Master Chief Jones, welcome. Your leadership is critically important today as the Coast Guard grapples with its inaction and the failure of transparency regarding past sexual assaults at the Coast Guard Academy. By not taking appropriate action to address past sexual misconduct at the Coast Guard Academy, the Coast Guard tragically failed to protect its most valuable assets, its people. Cadets entering the Coast Guard Academy commit to making great sacrifices in the service of their country and humanity. And yet, when the worst happened to them, the Coast Guard failed to return that commitment. A recent investigation of sexual assaults at the Coast Guard Academy found that many sexual assaults at the Academy were not taken seriously, and that the perpetrators of these crimes were dealt with administratively rather than criminally. More than 60 potential victims were identified in these investigations. The Coast Guard's insufficient action or outright inaction has caused further trauma for these victims and has blunted proper accountability for those responsible for these crimes. Moreover, the Coast Guard kept these investigations hidden from Congress for years, 3.5 years, delaying reporting the findings of the investigations to Congress. Admiral, you and I talked about that last night. That failure of transparency is unacceptable. We need to make improvements to ensure that this failure to notify Congress does not happen again. And you can be sure that this committee will be conducting rigorous oversight to ensure that these improvements are made. We owe our brave Coast Guardsmen, men and women, a workplace free from sexual assault and harassment, so that they can focus on their critical work of saving lives, intercepting drugs, and defending our maritime border, which is more important now than ever. For years, I've worked on a bipartisan basis with Senator Gillibrand to protect members of the military from sexual assault. Together, we led the fight to enact into law the Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act, which professionalized and improved how the military prosecutes sexual assault and other serious crimes. Senator Gillibrand and I also teamed up in a bipartisan way to enact into law the Cadet Act, which ended the unfair and antiquated policies that forced female students at America's military academies, including the Coast Guard Academy, into 3 terrible choices if a female cadet became pregnant. Either forcibly getting an abortion against her wishes, going to court and legally surrendering her parental rights over her child, or withdrawing from the service academy and repaying the federal government the cost of her entire education. This made no sense. It was frankly an idiotic policy, and I'm very glad that we were together able to pass in December the Cadet Act, changing that policy so that now women at our service academies, if they choose to be mothers, can be mothers to their children and can also serve and defend our nation at the same time. It is imperative that we work to ensure the dignity, the well-being, and the safety of our military members, including cadets who will one day form our officer corps. In Texas, Coast Guard members are on patrol 365 days a year. From Station South Padre Island to Sector Houston, Galveston, and beyond, Coast Guard members stand the watch to keep our citizens and our nation safe. Earlier this year, I introduced a resolution commending the Coast Guard for its outstanding work in safeguarding the American people through promotion of national security and maritime border security. It highlighted that during fiscal year 2022, the Coast Guard interdicted over 400,000 pounds of narcotics and over 12,000 illegal aliens, while conducting over 6,000 at-sea boardings of fishing vessels and stopping 87 foreign fishing incursions. In addition, the Coast Guard ensures economic security through rigorous vessel inspections and by keeping commerce moving in and over our waterways. At a time when our allies need clean U.S. energy abroad, I hope that Admiral Fagan can commit today that the Coast Guard will work expeditiously with the Maritime Administration to complete processing deepwater port license applications. The Coast Guard also plays an important role in setting schedules for drawbridges. In doing so, it must balance all the public interests of mariners, drivers, and road builders to keep the people and goods moving in all modes of transportation without compromising safety. The Coast Guard must work with all stakeholders in advance of changes and not impose a schedule that is impractical, even on a temporary basis. For example, a recent schedule change on a drawbridge on a rail corridor along the east coast of Florida threatens stoppages that would cause freight rail service to block nearby grade crossings and severely restrict the operations of passenger rail services. I understand a proposal has been offered by the railroads that would provide mariners with access to the waterway for 60% of the daylight hours. The Coast Guard needs to promptly adopt a workable schedule that recognizes all the stakeholders to give certainty to the mariners, the railroads, and their customers. I look forward to working with Admiral Fagan and Master Chief Jones to ensure that the Coast Guard continues its critical mission to safeguard our national security, our economy, and our way of life.
My time has expired. I yield back.
Next up, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to each of you for being here. Thank you for the service each of you provides. I want to take a minute in particular, Chief, to thank the men and women of the Capitol Police. In Texas and all across the country, I view a big part of my job as supporting the men and women of law enforcement, and I'm grateful for the courage of the men and women of Capitol Police and police officers all across our nation who risk their lives to keep Americans safe. I want to ask you, Chief, first of all, about your assessment of the current morale in the Capitol Police and the state of readiness of the Capitol Police to protect against the threats we're facing.
So I think morale is always in the eye of the beholder. I think it has improved since January 6th. We are still at a point, staffing-wise, where we're holding people over, we're canceling days off, and this has a big impact on morale. So we still have a ways to go. But I think that the cops understand that things are better than they were, and they are improving. I assure you that our state of readiness is good. There's still work to be done, but I have great confidence in the men and women of this department that they have the training, the courage, the equipment, and we, as in leadership, have good plans in place to ensure the safety of this campus.
Well, I'll tell you one concern that I have, and it's a growing concern, which is the rise of threats that are directed against lawmakers and lawmakers of both parties. We have seen an explosion of threats of violence against members of both parties. According to CBS News, Capitol Police investigated 7,500 cases of potential threats against lawmakers in 2022 alone. That is nearly double what the number of threats were in 2017. We have also seen multiple instances, whether it was the horrific shooting at the congressional baseball game where you had a deranged lunatic who came with the explicit objective of murdering Republican members of Congress. And it is only because of Steve Scalise, Capitol Police detail that happened to be there that deranged lunatic was stopped and killed. Had Congressman Scalise been late that morning, had he decided to take his kids to school that morning instead of going to the congressional baseball practice, there was no one else there that had a detail. And had Steve Scalise not been there that morning, the outcome of that morning likely would have been 2 dead senators and a dozen or more dead House members shot defenselessly in a bullpen in Northern Virginia. We have seen instances escalating from there, including we had a member of Congress attacked in the elevator of her apartment building. We had, tragically, a Senate staffer repeatedly stabbed in broad daylight here in Washington, D.C., just a couple of blocks from this hearing room. I am very concerned with this rising level of threats, and I fear we're going to wake up one day and somebody's going to be killed. On either side of the aisle, the number of lunatics who are seeking to do harm is growing. And so I want to ask you, what is your view of what needs to be done to prevent that, to ensure that we can protect the safety of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle in both houses from the growing and serious threats of violence and specific violence targeting individual members?
So the first step is for our Intelligence Bureau, which has been greatly expanded, to continue to be proactive in scrubbing social media to try and locate these threats. And so many of these threats, and you know this, Senator, we actually get them from the staffs of the members. But we also are able to pick some of these up early so that we can mitigate them as quickly as possible. In my budget, I've requested additional investigative agents because of the caseload. 500 cases per year per investigator. which is just unmanageable, and we need to do better than that. We also are working with state and local police departments all around the country to assist us in ensuring protection for members at events when they're in their home districts. But we've got to continue to, I know we're short on time. We need to do a better job at protecting members when they're home, their families.
And obviously, we have the tragic attack of Nancy Pelosi's husband at home, and all of our families are at risk.
And we had a congressman whose staff was attacked by a baseball bat-wielding man just a couple months ago. So we've got to make sure that we've got security measures in place in home district offices, in homes, so that it raises everybody's level of security.
Well, I'm working in a bipartisan way with Chairman Klobuchar, who is very concerned about this issue as well, and we're working on a Member Protection Act that would help enhance resources available to keep members and our families safe. And I hope with each of you here that you will work with us to try to address this problem so that we can address it proactively on the front end rather than being confronted with tragedy on the back end.
We're committed to do that, sir.
Thank you.
What purposes?
Mr. Nichols, I'm deeply concerned that the Western Hemisphere is being overwhelmed by anti-Americanism, and that countries across the region are aligning themselves with our adversaries and our enemies. I'm deeply concerned that former U.S. allies are being replaced by leaders who are actively hostile to us and our interests, and that the Biden administration has chosen to embrace many of those leaders. President Biden warmly hosted Lula da Silva at the White House and called him a close friend. Lula is an anti-American Chavista who embraces the Chinese Communist Party, Vladimir Putin, and the Iranian regime. I'll note that President Biden has not extended the same courtesy to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and indeed the Biden White House has made clear that Israel's Prime Minister is not welcome in the Biden White House. Now, one of the very insidious ways that our adversaries and our enemies have infiltrated the region is through corruption. China, Russia, and Iran all exploit endemic corruption, including and especially corruption driven by left-wing movements to advance their geopolitical agendas. Congress, and specifically this committee, has recognized the importance of combating such corruption and have given you powerful tools, in particular under Section 7031C, sanction authorities. The Biden administration has used these sanctions repeatedly across the Western Hemisphere, but not, I'm dismayed to say, not against the left-wing anti-American communists who are aligning with Russia and China and Iran. Quite the opposite. Again, the Biden administration has looked the other way at malign behavior from such actors. I want to ask you why that is, and I want to start in particular with Argentina. In Argentina, the federal judiciary found Cristina Fernandez, Argentina's former president and current vice president, guilty of overseeing and profiting from fraudulently issued government contracts to her associates for public works. According to the public record, the amounts we're talking about reach $1 billion. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison and given a lifetime ban on holding public office. Her current political role grants her immunity from jail, but I'm not aware of any such restriction placed by Congress on you from sanctioning her under Section 7031C. You sanctioned the sitting Paraguayan vice president last year. You've sanctioned former presidents in Panama and Ecuador. No one denies, and in fact, Argentina's courts have confirmed Cristina Fernandez is a kleptocrat. She has been indicted for obstructing investigations into Iranian terrorism. Why has the Biden administration not sanctioned her?
This administration has used the tools for sanctions, both visa and financial sanctions, repeatedly in numerous instances. You talk about sanctioning left-wing leaders. Certainly Nicaragua comes to mind. We've placed sanctions on scores and scores of officials from
Mr.
Nicaragua.
Nichols, my question concerned Argentina. Why have you not sanctioned Fernandez?
So the United States does not discuss pending sanctions actions, so I would not be able to discuss what we will or will not do with regard to
Well, you're refusing
any
to answer that, and I have to say this isn't changing. A year ago, I wrote Secretary Blinken about exactly this issue, sanctioning Cristina Fernandez under Section 7031C, and the State Department wrote back, and I'll quote what State said a year ago. Quote, President Biden and Secretary Blinken have made it a priority to fight corruption globally using all legal authorities available to them. That was nonsense then, and it's nonsense now. A year later, it is undisputed that she's a kleptocrat. Why is the Biden State Department giving her a pass?
We evaluate every case on its merits. We don't discuss specific cases before we take action. We have robust anti-corruption programs.
Does the state have an obligation to comply with Congress's oversight?
I'm
asking you why you're not following the law, and your answer is we don't answer that question.
Our answer is we don't publicly discuss pending sanctions actions.
Well, it's not pending. It's been sitting there for a long time. All right, let's shift to another example, Brazil. Bolsonaro, a pro-American leader, was replaced, to the Biden administration's cheering, with an anti-American radical Lula. And there is corruption likewise in the Lula government. In February, Lula allowed 2 of Iran's most advanced warships to dock in the port of Rio de Janeiro. The United States opposed that act, at least formally. In fact, the United States sanctioned those ships with what are supposed to be powerful designations, and yet it happened. I believe the Lula government's corruption played a significant role in their decision to ignore the Biden administration and allow the docking. Do you agree with that assessment? And has the Biden administration enforced any sanctions related to that instance, and in particular to the Brazilians providing material support to the Iranian ships?
The administration engaged our partners throughout the hemisphere, and we're very pleased that the Iranian ships were not able to dock anywhere else. We're deeply disappointed that one of the 2 ships was able to dock in Brazil, the other was offshore. I would refer you to OFAC for any additional information on
Has the Biden
sanctions
administration sanctioned the Brazilian government led by Joe Biden's self-described good friend, the anti-American leftist Lula? Have you sanctioned the Brazilian government for violating U.S. law and allowing the Iranian ships to dock?
I would refer you to OFAC as to whether or not they've made a determination that action violated
You don't know
sanctions.
whether you've sanctioned Brazil?
I would refer you to OFAC.
Do you know?
I would refer you to OFAC.
Do you know the answer? That's a yes or no question. Do you know whether the Biden administration has sanctioned Brazil?
I am not aware of any sanctions with regard to that specific situation.
Nor am I, and that's the problem.
I believe Senator Cardin was here at the top of the hearing. Is that correct? Senator Cardin?
Ms. Peters, one of President Biden's first acts after taking office was to issue Executive Order 14006, mandating that contracts with privately owned detention facilities not be renewed. The order is intended, quote, to decrease incarceration levels by reducing profit-based incentives to incarcerate by phasing out the federal government's reliance on privately operated criminal detention facilities. This order has created many unintended consequences, including the closing of the Willacy County Regional Detention Facility in Raymondville, Texas. The decision has had tremendous negative consequences with little to no obvious upside, forcing inmates to travel hundreds of miles round trip for court appearances, impacting the accessibility of legal counsel, and making family visits significantly more difficult. It has also caused administration issues for the prison system and harmed the local economy by eliminating these jobs. Literally every stakeholder that has a role to play in these cases is opposed to this Biden policy. That includes the defense bar, the federal public defender, the U.S. Attorney, even the federal bench, all have publicly asked for this policy to be rescinded. Unfortunately, as with the open borders under Joe Biden, the Biden administration doesn't give a damn about how their woke policies actually affect South Texas or the lives of regular people. Ms. Peters, how has Executive Order 14006 impacted the Bureau of Prisons' ability to house inmates, and has it been a negative impact or a positive impact?
Thank you, Senator. So we were able to come into compliance with the executive order the end of last November and bring in those individuals from those facilities that were closed, and we were able to safely absorb them into our current population.
Okay, that you didn't answer my question. How has it impacted the BOP, and has it been positive or negative?
Senator, I don't know that I can put it in a positive or negative category. What I can
So
say
is the defense bar and the U.S. Attorney and the federal bench, are they all wrong?
I'm not familiar with their opinions and their reasons for opposing.
Okay, unfortunately, you're illustrating that the Biden administration doesn't care about South Texas if you don't even know the impact it's having on all the stakeholders. All right, let's shift to the topic Senator Lee was just asking you about, because I have to say I found your answers to him thoroughly unacceptable. The 2022 Transgender Offender Manual, issued by the Bureau of Prison through your predecessors, reverted back to the Obama administration's initial designation and housing programming assignments. Notably, biological sex at birth is no longer the controlling determinant. Right now today, how many biological males are housed in female prisons under BOP?
Senator, I don't have those numbers in front of me today.
Why don't
but
you?
We could look at them and get back to you.
Why don't you?
I just don't have them top of
Did you know you were going to be asked that today?
No, Senator.
Oh, you didn't. Have you been asked that before?
On the record, Senator?
Yes.
I don't recall.
You were asked a year ago in writing, and you failed to answer it in writing. You knew damn well you're going to be asked it today, but you don't want to answer it. Senator Lee asked, why don't you report the numbers? You don't report the numbers because you don't want people to know the numbers. So the fact that you sit there and say, I don't know, he said 1,300. Is that number in the ballpark?
1,300 as it relates to which category, Senator?
Biological males housed in female prisons.
No, that would be a much larger number.
Which is a larger number?
So the number of individuals who even identify as transgender at the Federal Bureau of Prisons is around 1,700. And the number of individuals that are housed in institutions not conforming with their biological sex are very low.
Very low. Are we talking 100? Are we talking 10?
We will look at the numbers. We're talking less than 10.
So your testimony here, I just want to understand, your testimony here today is there are fewer than 10 biological males, human beings that were born male, who are housed in female prisons. Is that your testimony?
That is my understanding, and I will confirm that and get back to you.
Okay. Of the 1,700 prisoners you referenced, how many of them are convicted sex offenders?
I do not know the answer to that, Senator.
Are you aware that Great Britain's numbers, according to a January 2022 report, is the proportion of male-born transgender offenders who are sex offenders in the UK prison system is roughly 60%, significantly higher than the 18% of the general population? Are those numbers consistent with the American numbers?
I'm not familiar with Great Britain's numbers.
So let me ask you this. How many female inmates have been sexually assaulted by biological males who BOP has housed in female prisons?
Senator, I would have to look into that and get back to you.
Do you have an obligation to protect those female prisoners?
Absolutely.
And so have you examined how many women have been sexually assaulted by biological males that BOP has placed in the prison with those women?
I have not, Senator, but I will tell you that safety and security and the placement of every individual in our custody is top of mind and the most important.
So if it's top of mind, why haven't you examined how many have been sexually assaulted? This is an obvious question. If you put a man with male genitals, with a male body in a female prison who's a convicted sex offender, it's not rocket science that there's a real risk those women are going to be victims of sexual assault. How is it possible that you haven't even asked the question, how many women are getting sexually assaulted because of the policies of the Biden administration?
Senator, I assure you that safety and security of these individuals are top of mind. And if
So
there-
you haven't asked the question.
If there was misconduct, those individuals would be held accountable.
Thank you, Senator Cruz.
Say at the outset, all four of the nominees before us are qualified for the positions for which you've been nominated. Each of you has impressive professional credentials, and I have to note, Commissioner Slaughter and General Holyoke, your children are absolutely precious and gorgeous. They are 8 of the most fantastic children to have been in this hearing room. And I will say, being married to Heidi Cruz, the mom of 2 girls, I respect both of you and the professional careers you've led while taking on the extraordinary challenging job of being a mom at the same time. That is not easy, and you have a lot to be proud of. I also want to say to General Ferguson and General Holyoke, you are both serving as state solicitors general. I might question your judgment and sanity for choosing to leave one of the best jobs on planet Earth to join the FTC, but nonetheless, congratulations on the nomination, and I look forward to your serving honorably there. Commissioner Slaughter, I want to continue a conversation that you and I had earlier this week. And it's a conversation about what's been happening at the FTC. The FTC, I spent 2 years there. It's an institution I love. It's an institution with incredible men and women who are dedicated career professionals. It is a bipartisan institution. It's an institution that for decades has worked well and built a reputation for ethics and integrity. And as you know, I am deeply concerned that in the last 2 years, that reputation has been damaged profoundly. Now, I would note, these questions really should not be directed at you. Chair Khan, who is sitting in this hearing room today, has not testified before this committee since April 21st, 2021, her confirmation hearing. That's 882 days without a single oversight hearing. So this committee has not had the opportunity to question Chair Khan on what has been a disastrous tenure as chair of the FTC. Since she is not at the witness table right now, although I hope she will be very soon, I'm going to instead ask you about the conduct that has occurred under her watch, but under your watch as well. And I recognize as a commissioner, it's not easy to stand up to the chairman of the committee, particularly a chairman of the same party that appointed you. As you know, in February, former FTC Commissioner Wilson wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed in which she explained her decision to resign from the FTC. One of the bases of that decision, she criticized your decision and Commissioner Bedoya's decision to heavily redact one of her dissents, which had highlighted the fact that Chairman Khan had ignored the recusal advice of the FTC's designated agency ethics official. Unlike with other information, FTC information that is protected from disclosure by law, here there is no statutory prohibition on Commissioner Wilson revealing the designated agency ethics official's advice in her dissent. Yet the FTC majority, you and Commissioner Bedoya, imposed the redactions involuntarily under the guise of protecting staff deliberations. I have to admit, I've never seen this happen before. I've never seen a dissent forcibly redacted. Now, since those redactions, the original dissent has been made public and is in the public domain. And I want to compare the original dissent to what you voted to release. The original dissent said, and I quote, "Here the FTC ethics staff had strong reservations with Chair Khan, participating in an adjudication in this proceeding where, fairly recently, before joining the commission, she repeatedly called the FTC to block any further acquisition of Facebook. In the view of the FTC ethics staff, these statements would raise a question in the mind of a reasonable person about Chair Khan's impartiality as an adjudicator in the commission's meta within merger review. The FTC ethics staff therefore concluded that a reasonable person would question Chair Khan's impartiality when serving as an adjudicator in meta within." Those are very serious allegations that the career staff advised the chair that it was unethical for her to participate in the proceeding. She disregarded that advice, acted as a deciding vote nonetheless,
And then when Commissioner Wilson sought to let the world know about it, you and your colleagues voted to release, on the right is what was released. That entire paragraph was blocked out. Do you believe the information that Commissioner Wilson was focusing on was relevant to the public allegations that the chair was behaving unethically? And if so, do you think the commission operated properly, hiding it from the American people and demanding that it be redacted from the dissent?
Thank you for the question, Senator. And I want to say thank you for your kind words about my family. I'm incredibly proud of them. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. You're right that there is no statute that requires the protection of information prepared by staff for commission deliberations, but there is a commission rule. It was put in place by Chairman Jim Miller in the 1980s, and it says that staff deliberations cannot be made public, or information prepared by staff for commission deliberations cannot be made public. And it has been applied equally to commissioners of both parties. So commissioners decide what to put in their opinions and dissents. I have never chosen to put, I don't believe I've ever chosen to put information that would have to be redacted into opinions I've written, but I know my former colleague, Commissioner Chopra, did sometimes, and his opinions had to be redacted pursuant to commission rules. And I think the rules are there. We should follow them because they're there, but I also think they're there to protect something really important, which is candid advice from our staff. I rely on our staff to tell me what they think. That's valuable when I end up agreeing with them. It's even more valuable if I don't agree with them at the end of the day. And I want them to feel protected, that they can give me that candid advice without being caught in between public debates and debates between commissioners. We are all free to adopt staff opinions as our own, to articulate our reasoning, and that is an important thing for us to do, because I do think we should be publicly accountable for the choices that we make, but I don't think that we should be putting staff in the middle of those debates, and the commission rules prohibit us from doing so.
Well, I would point out that has not been the practice of the FTC in the past, and I'd like to enter into the record two documents, one from 1999, a second from 2007, both of which are FTC public documents released to the public that described the recommendations of a designated agency ethics official, and the FTC has done that in the past. And in this instance, when the allegation is the chair is behaving unethically, I think the commission has an obligation to make those allegations public, and it explains a lot why the staff believes integrity has gone down so severely in the last 2 years. I'd like to enter these in the
Without objection. Senator.
Second round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Slaughter, I want to go back to the questions that Senator Capito asked. I think there is a disturbing pattern in the Biden administration of federal employees not showing up for work. And after the pandemic, the Biden administration has decided that federal work doesn't actually entail going to the office, and it is the absenteeism is a massive problem throughout the Biden administration. My staff inquired of the FTC what the data are, and I'll tell you what your staff told us. As of June 30th, 103 staff, approximately 8% of the FTC employees, are working remotely. Now, that on its face doesn't sound horrific. 8% of the staff is teleworking, not going into the office at all. They then continue to say the remaining 92% of the workforce are reporting to the office on a regular recurring basis. Well, regular recurring basis sounds good until they specify, and this is based on the badging. So the badges, when you're coming in and out of the office, there are records. According to the FTC, of the, quote, regularly recurring working staff, 60% of them are showing up to work 1 day a week. Another 20% are showing up to work 2 days a week. And another 20% are showing up to work 3 to 5 days a week. Notice 3 to 5 doesn't specify. So we don't know how many are showing up 5 days a week. I got to tell you, when I was at the FTC in 2001 and 2002 and 2003, to the best of my knowledge, every single employee showed up at the office 5 days a week unless they were sick or on vacation, because it was a job. It was a job for the American people, paid for by the taxpayers. You mentioned the private sector. I don't know a single private sector employer that sits there and allows 80+% of their employees not to show up for work. Do you think it is being faithful to the American people that under your leadership and Chair Khan's leadership, although she has now left, that over 80% of the employees are showing up to work 2 days a week or less?
Senator, I think it's really important to distinguish between working from in the office and the concept of showing up to work.
Do you think it's okay? Do you think it is acceptable to the American people? You know what? If you're a steel worker, if you're a truck driver, if you're a waiter, if you're a waitress, there are a whole ton of jobs. You don't have the chance to sit at home. You don't have the chance to go play golf on Fridays and Mondays when you want to and treat it like a part-time job. Do you think the American people, you are honoring your commitment to the American people by having over 80% of the staff not in the office at least 3 days a week and maybe 4 or more?
If I believed that anyone at the agency was treating their full-time job like a part-time job or going off and playing golf, I would have a huge problem with it. But what I know them to be doing is working.
Do you believe it is okay that over 80% of the staff does not show up physically in the office 3 days a week or more?
I believe that that is 100% consistent with the guidance that we have gotten. It is different.
Guidance from whom?
I believe the Office of Personnel Management, but I want to get back to you about it.
I believe you because it's a problem throughout the Biden administration. The Biden administration has decided federal employees don't need to show up to work, and I'll tell you, the rest of the country shows up to work. So that is distressing. Let's shift to another look, and I think this is endemic of an attitude, which is that this agency is unaccountable. When you and I sat down and talked, I asked you about multiple oversight letters I had sent to the agency that you still had not responded on. Do you have any of those oversight responses here today?
Well, Senator, as you know, I'm not the chair of the agency. The letters are directed at the chair's office, and the chair's office is charged with responding.
So it is the chair that is being recalcitrant. I believe you there. Let's go back to the chair. We talked about how the chair deliberately disregarded the advice of the designated agency ethics official, and then you and Commissioner Bedoya voted with the chair to forcibly redact Commissioner Wilson's dissent, letting the public know that. Subsequently, during an April hearing before the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, Chair Khan was asked, were there any instances where she had, quote, not followed the designated agency ethics official's advice? Here's what she said, quote, no, in instances where companies like Facebook or Amazon have petitioned for my recusal, I have consulted with the DAO and have taken actions that are consistent with the legal statements the DAO has made. Was that a truthful and candid response?
First of all, I think the chair should be able to speak for herself.
I'd love to, but she hasn't testified in over 800 days here, so you're the only commissioner that we have in front of us.
I also want to be consistent with what I told you before about not wanting to disclose staff guidance myself, but since you referenced that it was already in the public, that memo that is in the public says that the rules do not require the chair's recusal in that case, and I think I understood her to be saying that.
So you believe that was a truthful and candid advice? She's speaking so precisely as a lawyer. She says, I've not taken, I have consulted with the DAO and have taken actions that are consistent with the legal statements the DAO has made. And legal statements, boy, those words are carrying a lot of work. Because you're right, the DAO didn't say you are legally required, you must recuse. The DAO said, I recommend that you recuse because it's a serious problem. There's a perception of bias. She ignored that recommendation. We just read through that. And then she goes to Congress under oath and doesn't acknowledge that she took a recommendation from the DAO and ignored it. She just said, well, I followed the legal statements. Do you consider that truthful and candid testimony?
Senator, I really don't think it's appropriate for me to opine on it. I will tell you that
why not?
Sitting here, because I wasn't in the chair's head.
Well, you voted to censor the evidence that would have shown that was a lie.
I voted consistent with commission rules to follow the commission.
Except I showed you multiple instances where the commission has released that information.
But I wasn't part of those decisions, and my job is to follow the commission rules as I see them.
Let me ask you subsequently. As you know, I, along with Chairman Comer and Chairman Jordan, sent a letter to the FTC investigating many of its abusive actions. The FTC stated in response that per agency practice, it had deleted the email accounts of former employees who had worked on a non-competing agreement rulemaking soon after they left the agency. Now, under federal law, agencies are required to protect federal records, are required to keep them for 7 years. Under 44 U.S. Code, Section
301, the definition of records includes all recorded information, and as NARA says, that includes electronic messages, including email, instant messages, and texts. Why is the FTC purging its emails of all of the emails of employees as soon as they leave? And in particular here, you've got two employees that came from left-wing advocacy groups that went and worked at the FTC, and as soon as they leave, you erase all of the records in direct contravention of federal law and acting to shield those records from investigation from congressional oversight.
Senator, since I got to the FTC, I've worked really hard to understand what the rules around record retention are, because they're different from where I came from in the Senate, where there are not similar rules. And I'll tell you, the rules are actually a little bit hard to understand. The guidance I got from our general counsel's office and the secretary's office from the beginning is that all emails are not federal records. Certain things are federal records that are required to be preserved. Also, we're required to preserve anything that's subject to a FOIA request or a litigation hold. But outside of that, we are not required to preserve things, and in fact are directed to delete more for emails, data security,
So I will say my time
hygiene
has
purposes.
expired, but I'll point out that that definition is hyper-technical, because as I understand it, the FTC operates under the fiction that when an employee is leaving, that employee will print out and save whichever emails are federal records. And so the agency can then just go and delete them all. Now, I don't know anyone who does that, and you don't know anyone who does that. That is designed to prevent litigation from getting access to those emails and prevent congressional oversight. And given the pattern of unethical behavior by the chair of this commission, and then the pattern of the commissioners being willing to cover it up, deleting emails in defiance of congressional oversight is deeply troubling, and it suggests an agency that believes it is not accountable to the American people.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Raimondo, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the NEPA reviews are currently required for CHIPS grants, and that could lengthen project timelines by 2 years or more from the date the department decides to start an environmental impact statement. Some NEPA reports aren't completed for 7 years or longer. When you were asked about hurdles posed by NEPA to CHIPS projects in a House hearing last month, you pointed out there's currently a bipartisan amendment to the Defense Authorization Act, which would help a lot. So we're going to do everything we can with our team to help streamline NEPA and move it as quickly as is prudent. But if Congress could pass the amendment, I think it's the Cruz-Kelly amendment in the Authorization Act, it would help us a lot to move faster. As you know, that bipartisan amendment passed the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support, but it is not yet law. It still has to pass the House and ultimately be signed into law by the President. Could you briefly describe the benefits the amendment would provide as a word of encouragement to the House and the White House to make it law?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your leadership on that. As you say, each of these projects, if they receive federal money, would be subject to NEPA, which could take up to years. We do not have years. These are national security imperative projects, which is why I, again, thank you for your leadership. What we are doing, we've built a team on the CHIPS team in the Commerce Department just to focus on permitting, to help companies, help states streamline the process, accelerate the process within the existing statute. Let me be clear. We don't want to, environmental concerns matter. We are not in any way suggesting that we should do anything that hurts the environment or is unsustainable. That being said, we do need to, which your amendment would do, streamline the process, speed the process, make the process more efficient and user-friendly. Interestingly, earlier today, I was on the phone with members of the House on this exact issue, encouraging them to do their own, take your lead and pass something in the House. My view is it's essential. We're going to do everything we can. We have a team. We're working on it. But without the legislation, it is very difficult.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. Let me turn to the topic of spectrum, something both you and I care a lot about. We all know that the United States needs more commercial access to mid-band spectrum. Recent studies project that U.S. mobile traffic to increase more than 2.5 times over the next 5 years and almost sixfold in the next 10 years. We need a real mid-band spectrum pipeline so that the U.S. can dominate in 5G and not fall behind our adversaries. Unfortunately, access to mid-band spectrum has become almost impossible to come by because so much of the nation's spectrum is under the control of federal agencies who are resistant to sharing. The Defense Department recently completed its report on opening access to spectrum in the lower 3 gigahertz band and gave it to your department at the end of last week. The report has not been made public, but according to leaks, the report does not support sharing, let alone allowing full-power 5G use in the band. Secretary Raimondo, you and I had a very productive call yesterday, and during that call, you committed to sharing the report with me and briefing me on it. I appreciate that. Do you agree that we need more mid-band spectrum to be made available for 5G, including for full-power use, and that it is not only imperative for our economy, but also for our national security?
I do. Let me say this. As I said yesterday, I think I'd be very happy to have my staff, NTIA, and the DOD, I think we should do it together, to come and go through the report. So we'll set that up.
I appreciate that.
And yes, I do. You know, I spoke with Secretary Austin last week, and I said, the DOD needs the spectrum they need to execute their mission, period. Having said that, we also need to be more creative and innovative about how we share spectrum and how we use spectrum, because the truth of the matter is our national defense depends on, as you say, continued private sector innovation and continued innovation in 5G. And my point to him and my point to you and anyone who wants to hear from me is that this shouldn't be a zero-sum game, right? We shouldn't think every time the DOD shares or gives something up, they're losing capacity. We have to find creative ways where we can have more spectrum made available in the mid-range band, as you say, and also the DOD has what they need to do their mission. And I'm committed to working with you and with them to do that.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Director Panchanathan, during fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22, the NSF funded some 70 grants and 2 contracts, totaling over $45 million, focused on both the quote-unquote science of countering social media mis- and disinformation, as well as the development of digital tools to track and censor so-called mis- or disinformation. One of the projects was called Expert Voices Together, and it is, to quote the NSF, quote, creating a comprehensive system of care that addresses the harms journalists experience due to online harassment. Its mission, incredibly enough, is to, quote, support journalists in moments of crisis while helping the media industry build resilience long-term. In other words, taxpayer-funded therapy for left-wing journalists who find actual facts traumatizing. I'm sure people like Taylor Lorenz will be excited about that. But where on earth in the NSF's mandate is there a justification for these sorts of projects? And do you believe that venturing into such politicized topics undermines broader support for the NSF?
Senator, first of all, let me tell you that the reach, I hope that through the hearing today, you will get to see NSF's broad impact all across our nation through STEM talent development, through economic vibrancy that NSF makes possible, and yes, national security objectives also being fostered. I hope that the examples that I will give you, and in the answer, I'm not trying to package all of that, but I hope that that will come through very clearly. We're doing a lot of work about how to make sure the talent everywhere and innovation everywhere is energized.
Could you answer the question, though, that I asked?
Yes, I'm just going to come to that, Senator, because I just want to make sure that the NSF mission is, I just want to make sure that that is clearly understood also. I want to say one thing very categorically. NSF does not engage in censorship. We do not regulate any content and engage with anybody who also does so. But what we do is, how do the technologies operate and how are they being used, and provide the public and policymakers the information that they need so that you can make the informed decisions about needed regulations and guardrails. And for the users, that they have the tool that they can safely navigate content. That's what NSF is engaged in. That's the kind of projects that we fund. We are not in the business of censorship. We are not in the business of controlling content. I can tell you, for example, even in this conversation that we are having right now, in the deepfake realm, this conversation can be completely altered and presented in a form that you and I will say, how did it even happen? That this conversation that we are having right now has been transformed into something that's even unrecognizable. These kinds of things that happen, we are trying to find how can we build, how can we invest in those projects, and how can we invest in tools and techniques that can help safeguard. And that's all we are doing. We are not censoring, and I want to repeat that, we are not altering content.
When you're funding others who are engaged in censorship, you're undermining support for your very important agency.
Senator, maybe I can close with this comment. I'm happy to work with any of you to go through this with you in more of a one-on-one setting and explain what these projects are doing so that it can be helpful. Happy to take your suggestions, happy to take your inputs. NSF, I always say NSF is a learning agency. We learn constantly because we cannot be an agency that says, this is how we do it. We are a learning agency, so happy to take the input and see where, if any, you find that there is, NSF appearing to be, as I have said, we are not, but I'm happy to have the discussion with you.
Thank you.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, the committee will consider nominations to key posts at the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Trade Commission, Amtrak, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, as well as the promotion of 2 Coast Guard officers. Turning to the nominees, I support the confirmation of Michael Whitaker to be the next FAA administrator. His extensive aviation experience makes him well-suited to lead our nation's largest transportation safety agency, and he has pledged to this committee to stay out of politics and to focus on aviation safety, the FAA's primary responsibility. Mr. Whitaker's confirmation will bring to an end what was an avoidable 18-month gap in FAA leadership. It is unfortunate that the President took so long to heed my advice and the advice of many on this committee to nominate someone with actual aviation experience and aviation safety experience. Hopefully, this committee will soon turn to resuming consideration of the FAA reauthorization bill so that once confirmed, Mr. Whitaker will have the tools necessary to do his job. My Republican colleagues and I stand ready to hold amendment votes and to mark up our bill to avoid another extension. Today, the committee will also consider the nominations of Andrew Ferguson, Melissa Holyoke, and current Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter to the FTC. 3 well-qualified nominees whom I support. With Ms. Holyoke's and Mr. Ferguson's confirmations, the FTC will be bipartisan once again. When I was at the FTC, now 2 decades ago, bipartisanship was a defining characteristic of the agency, and one of the reasons it was so often successful. Sadly, FTC Chairwoman Lena Khan has abandoned that legacy in favor of a partisan, legally suspect agenda that has devastated employee morale in the process. Mr. Ferguson and Ms. Holyoke will hopefully serve as much-needed checks on Chairwoman Khan. This committee also has an important constitutional responsibility to serve as a check on the FTC, one that right now this committee is not fulfilling. Astonishingly, we have not had a hearing with Chairwoman Khan in 910 days since she was first confirmed to that position. That's unacceptable. I will note that Republicans on this committee agreed to quickly move and process Mr. Whitaker's nomination to the FAA. And I hope that this committee will respond with similar comedy and schedule an FTC oversight hearing with Chair Khan soon. The FTC continues to take an unreasonably expansive view of its authorities under Chair Khan's leadership that this committee has an obligation to ask her about. She is also not responding adequately to my oversight letters. I have sent 7 oversight letters this year to Chair Khan, and she has provided a complete response to only 1 of them. This administration is not unaccountable even if they behave as if they believe they are. In addition to the FAA and FTC nominees, the committee will consider 3 nominations to Amtrak's board of directors. Amtrak receives billions in federal subsidies, so it needs board members who will ask tough questions to ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent responsibly and lawfully. One important area of inquiry for the board should be the delay in Amtrak's acquisition of new high-speed Acela train sets and the resulting cost increases that total many millions of dollars. I have been investigating this matter and have sent oversight letters to both Amtrak and the Department of Transportation. Amtrak has cooperated. DOT has just begun cooperating. One other issue is President Biden's current slate of nominees does not comply with the statutory requirement that no more than 4 of the 8 board members be from a state along the Northeast Corridor, a fact that I have raised since April. Last week, the president promised to bring his slate into compliance by substituting someone from outside the Northeast Corridor for one of the current Democrat nominees. Senator Tester, in particular, has been vocal and very effective on this issue. Based on President Biden's assurance and Amtrak's good faith cooperation with my investigation, I will today support moving the nominees out of committee. However, whether I can support floor consideration of the Democrat nominees will be up to President Biden and the Department of Transportation. The president must follow through on his promise, and DOT and Amtrak must continue cooperating with my investigation. Lastly, I want to turn to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Doug Ziak is experienced in consumer product safety matters, has shown an ability to work in a bipartisan fashion to protect American consumers, and is well qualified to serve as a CPSC commissioner. I look forward to his confirmation, as well as the confirmation of the other 7 nominees and the 2 Coast Guard promotions pending before the committee today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I will now recognize you for a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that PN 980, the nomination of Michael G. Whitaker of Vermont to be Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. PN 304, the nomination of Rebecca K. Slaughter of Maryland to be a Federal Trade Commissioner. PN 801, the nomination of Melissa A. Holyoke of Utah to be a Federal Trade Commissioner. PN 799 and PN 800, the nomination of Andrew N. Ferguson of Virginia to be a Federal Trade Commissioner. PN 14, the nomination of Anthony R. Kosha of New Jersey to be a Director of the Amtrak Board of Directors. PN 15, the nomination of Chris Coons of Illinois to be a Director of the Amtrak Board of Directors. PN 13, the nomination of Joel M. Shabbat of Maryland to be a Director of the Amtrak Board of Directors. PN 482, the nomination of Doug Ziak of Virginia to be a Commissioner of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And PN 978, Coast Guard promotions, be favorably reported.
Is there a second?